Welcome back to the Rooted in Resilience podcast. Today we have one of our favorite guests on the show, Georgi Dinkov. Georgi, how are you doing?
Not bad. About the same.
You're
Enjoying
still
the
in
weather.
DC?
Yeah. DC proper, like in the city.
Okay, and you're still running Idea Labs, and then you also are doing another job?
Yeah, I have a day job in IT, basically, and then Idea Labs is just a side gig, if you can call it that, because it's a second full-time job if you look at all the hours that go into it.
But then you're also doing research studies with mice and cancer and B vitamins.
Yes, and I have 2 kids, and I have disabled relatives, among other things.
Whew.
To take care of, yeah.
How are the lab studies going with the mice?
I think you've seen the one on Twitter that I posted. Did a couple of updates. So basically, in full confirmation of Ray's writings and ideas, a combination of the vitamins B1, B3, and B7 and aspirin completely obliterated a human tumor transplanted into mice, also known as a xenograft model. And the human tumor is known as the JECO1 line, JEKO-1 line. So it's a human mantle cell lymphoma, and it's the deadliest model that the lab has. It has 0% spontaneous regression. In other words, it's not, they have never seen this tumor regress like basically on its own. And it has 100% lethality, even with treatment. So I thought basically, if I want to try raise ideas on something, it should be tried on that. And another reason was that because it was so lethal, the studies would last a very short amount of time. So time is of the essence, right? I don't want to do a study that lasts 6 months and then find out that it's not working, right? So it was perfect. My daughter used to tell me that if you want to learn how to love, you should train on somebody you really hate. So I thought, wow, like I twisted that and said, okay, if I want to cure something, then maybe I should try to test it on something really, really lethal. Lo and behold, basically, I've tried the vitamins by themselves before. It was a lot of trial and error. First, I tried only vitamin B1 by itself. It had like a minor effect, but wasn't enough. Then I added the B3. So the B1 and B3 by themselves were able to basically flatten the curve of the tumor growth and made it basically like a chronic disease. The tumor is still there, but it's not going to kill you. And then I looked at there's some human studies with Biotin, which is vitamin B7 recent, and it was a really interesting trial with primary progressive multiple sclerosis, where basically a massive dose of Biotin, 300 milligrams daily for an adult human, stopped the progression. And by the way, it's a disease that's not known to stop at all, let alone remiss, right? To go into remission. But that initial pilot trial with about 20 people showed that the Biotin was effective. And even the doctors in that study said, well, we cannot propose any other mechanism other than the restoration of mitochondrial function, which is one of the main known effects of high dose Biotin. So I said, okay, there you go. So let's try the Biotin as well. So the combination of B1, B3, and B7, the Biotin, actually completely stopped the curve and actually started making it regress. So I said, okay, we're on the right track.
Do you think that that's because restored like proper oxidative phosphorylation?
There are multiple mechanisms. So basically, the theory that Ray has been discussing and that I've been researching, and it's not a new theory. It's actually the original researchers on cancer, Otto Warburg, Linus Pauling, Albert Szent-Györgyi, they all thought that cancer is a metabolic disease. They just didn't know what can be done to reverse that metabolic defect. But they said, no, there's nothing genetic about it because, we're seeing it in young people. We see rates, go up and down all the time. So it's definitely not something that can happen in terms of mutations in such a short period of time. So they thought that it was a metabolic disease, especially Otto Warburg, under whom the famous Warburg effect is named. So basically, after researching, and research studies show that vitamin B1, it's been known for a long time that it's a cofactor for the enzyme pyruvate dehydrogenase. And it was there was a study with a chemical that was activating pyruvate dehydrogenase. That chemical is known as dichloroacetate. So it made all the news back in 2010, 2011, and they didn't know what mechanism of action it had, but there was some really high-profile cases in Canada where the limited human trials were done. People with like late-stage brain cancer, which is deadly. Senator, what was his name from Arizona? McCain died from that. Senator Ted Kennedy died from that. So really, there's not much they can do for you. The prognosis is about 12 to 15 months with treatment. So with this chemical dichloroacetate, there were some very high-profile complete cures And after that, all the news about it stopped. It's an unpatentable chemical, and if you want to run a proper clinical trial, you need about $2 billion. And the University of Toronto was trying to raise that money. I don't think they ever did. But Ray mentioned that chemical a couple of times in his articles, and he said that, according to him, the main mechanism of action is because it restores the metabolism of glucose. And cancer, being an extreme form of diabetes, which is according to the metabolic theory, is almost entirely reliant on the oxidation of fats. So according to the Randall cycle, if you block or at least restrict the oxidation of fats and promote the oxidation of glucose, if cancer is truly a metabolic disease, things should revert back to normal. So what can you do? Well, in terms of accelerating glucose metabolism, you activate pyruvate dehydrogenase, which is the rate-limiting step of the oxidative metabolism of glucose. So without that, you only get glycolysis, which is the cancer. Several studies, actually very old ones, actually proposed that cancer is nothing but vitamin B1 deficiency. Not much came out of this. They were just proposals. But then I saw a study from China, I think it was from 2010, where they injected several solid tumors in humans directly with vitamin B1, and the tumors disappeared. And they did a follow-up study with dogs doing the exact same thing, direct delivery into the tumor, which is hard for most tumors. But, when you're doing with animal models, you can ethically afford to do it. And then again, it was a curative effect. They said, well, confirms Otto Warburg's and Ray's writings, right? So let's focus on B1. So I had B1. And then niacinamide, many discussions about it. Ray has written about it. Probably every single article that he says puts out mentions niacinamide there. Well, it's the precursor to NAD+, right? And it's known that cancer cells are in a highly reduced state. In other words, they're low on NAD+, and they're high on NADH. So when you provide the precursor to NAD+ in the form of niacinamide, you're hoping that you're going to raise that NAD+ to the NADH ratio, which puts the cell, cancer cell, I'm calling in quotes because it turns out it's really, there's no such thing as a cancer cell. Nothing inside structurally.
It's more of like a state.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Think of it as an extreme stress state, indistinguishable actually from diabetes type 1. Not many people know, but before insulin was discovered, getting diagnosed with type 1 diabetes was essentially a death sentence. And it had the exact same wasting phenotype that cancer did, and basically progressed very similar to cancer. So the diabetic patients, type 1, they died in an extremely cachectic form, looked like skeletons just before they died. And basically what insulin does, interestingly, it lowers lipolysis. So the Ray said that his father developed type 1 diabetes at a very early age. And I guess at the time insulin wasn't very well known or wasn't widely used. So he cured himself, or at least prevented the dying, by eating massive amounts of brewer's yeast, which is very high on the B vitamins, especially vitamin B3. So it looks like that type 1 diabetes is actually, you can call it either a precursor or an equivalent stage to cancer, where basically the cells get flooded with fats. And in fact, it's the fats. It's already known that the fats that destroy the beta cells in the pancreas. So basically you don't produce insulin. But if you give these people insulin, they can live normal lives, and the life expectancy is not that different from a healthy person. So diabetes type 1, if we can call it the non-metastatic version of cancer, is actually indistinguishable from cancer metabolically and can be treated with insulin. Interestingly enough, there are clinics in Switzerland, Mexico, and several other countries that are now promoting insulin therapy for cancer. And I think that's actually a very good idea, because if the metabolism of cancer is driven predominantly by fat, basically the two ways you can reverse that is that first you limit the intake of dietary fat, right? But then we also know that there's plenty of fat stored in the organism, and because since in a cancer state you're basically in a very high stress state, you're going to have an elevated levels of lipolysis, which means there will be a lot of fat being processed from the fatty tissues and supplied to the cancer cells. So the way you block this is by lowering lipolysis, and insulin is the most powerful known anti-lipolytic agent that we have producing in our bodies. So several clinics are offering this as therapy, and even some published case studies where I don't think they achieved full cure, but they prevented people from dying from metastatic breast cancer, metastatic lung cancer, about as deadly as pancreatic and as the brain cancers. So all these things are converging into basically mapping perfectly to the theory, which says cancer is a stress state, extreme stress state, and whenever you're in an extreme stress state, even if you don't have cancer, you have an excess of supply of fat and as such oxidation of fat, and due to the Randall cycle, you have basically decreased metabolism of glucose. So in theory, if this is all there is to cancer and many other serious diseases, you should be able to reverse the pathology by simply restricting both the oxidation and supply of fats, and conversely promoting the oxidation of glucose. And that's all I did. So niacinamide is also inhibiting excessive lipolysis, and the NAD plus to the NADH ratio is also controlling the function of pyruvate dehydrogenase. In other words, it's synergizing with thiamine, with B1. So these two vitamins by themselves were able to flatten the curve of that same JACO1 line. And I've done it maybe at least 12 studies by now until I found the final treatment, quote unquote, the 3 vitamins plus aspirin. So I said, okay, so we have pyruvate dehydrogenase, we have the NAD plus to the NADH ratio. What is biotin doing? A study that I posted on the forum around 2015, long before I had this idea of trying this. It was an in vitro study and showed that the addition of biotin to the cells, amongst all the other substances that they tried, including vitamins B1 and B3, drastically increased the production of carbon dioxide, which is a very, very good sign that biotin has a potent, at least pro-Krebs cycle effect, because the carbon dioxide is produced in the Krebs cycle, which is still part of oxidative phosphorylation. So I said, okay, I remember that study, and then I saw the studies with humans about multiple sclerosis, Huntington disease. Another study recently showed great promise. ALS, also another deadly neurodegenerative disease. So I said, okay, let's try it. Okay, I mean, we have enough signal, at least for me, to try it. So I added the biotin, and lo and behold, not only complete flattening, but little dips and recovers, but the dips and recovers, every recovery was lower than the previous one. So if the study had continued for long enough, I think that eventually we would have seen cure. But the lab basically charges you an arm and a leg, and they say the study should last 28 days. So they can extend it, but you basically be paying for a full new study. And these things are not cheap. I work with mice, and the lab charges $200 per mice per 28 days. So the combination of everything, got to keep it simple, cheap, has to be fast, it has to be really effective. So I chose that model. And then when I added the 3 vitamins, I saw that we're on the right track, right? So I said, okay, what else can be done? Well, our old friend aspirin. I mean, again, there's hardly an article that Ray has written or an interview that he has given that he has not mentioned aspirin. And aspirin actually is probably the only one of the 4 substances that actually kind of has a bit of a following in the medical world as well. Plenty of doctors out there, unfortunately now they're kind of getting silenced, have known that that aspirin has a very strong preventative effect on virtually every cancer you can imagine. Multiple studies published about this, but it never went from preventing it to trying to cure it. That would be sacrilege, Georgie. How dare you? This thing costs pennies and is available everywhere. You tell him that this thing cure cancer, then what am I doing as an oncologist? Am I killing people by giving them cytotoxic therapy? Yeah. So added the aspirin. I mean, it's a highest dose compared to what most people are used to seeing, but not nearly as high as what used to be used to be used to treat things like rheumatoid arthritis or even multiple sclerosis back in like the 50s and 60s when they didn't have anything other than the glucocorticoid therapy. And even then, back then, doctors knew that if somebody has a rheumatoid arthritis, you can't keep him on cortisol their whole life. The cortisol is going to destroy the health. So the only option was some kind of a strong anti-inflammatory. And at the time, that treatment was aspirin. To this day, people who cannot tolerate glucocorticoids or whatnot, they're taking 4 to 8 grams of aspirin daily to manage their rheumatoid arthritis, and it works. So the dosage that I used is equivalent to 15 milligrams per kilogram of body weight daily for a human, which means that even somebody who weighs about, let's say, 250 pounds, that's about 1.5 grams of aspirin. Hefty, not nearly as close to what people have been using for decades to treat their rheumatoid arthritis.
So that would be for me. For me, that would be. I
mean, that's like 5 regular tablets of aspirin. Let's say 4. For most people, it'd be 4 regular tablets of aspirin. By the way, that specific dosage been used on people with multiple sclerosis and Crohn's disease, and it completely abolished their fatigue, which is one of the main symptoms that people with autoimmune conditions have. Which shows you that since aspirin is not only anti-inflammatory, but it's a pro-mitochondrial nutrient. It's also a carbonic anhydrase inhibitor. Recent studies demonstrated that too. So it also increases the production of carbon dioxide in the body. Anyways, added the aspirin at this dosage. Within, I think that one of the mice got cured within 7 days. There wasn't even growth. It just immediately went down, and then complete disappearance of the tumor, right? And then I said, okay, the lab said, okay, do you want to kill that mouse? I'm like, no, why would I want to kill the healthy animal? Let's keep it alive and see what happens. So they stopped the treatment, kept the mouse alive, to see if there's any regrowth or regression, as they call it. Relapse. I'm sorry. So it was full regression of the tumor without any growth. And then, and a lot of doctors will tell, well, we can achieve that in the clinic, Georgia. This is nothing new. We can kill the initial tumor, but then invariably it comes back a year or two later, and then it becomes metastatic, and it kills the patient. Okay, so I said, let's try it out. So we stopped the treatment on that first mouse and kept that mouse alive. By the way, that study went for 78 days. I paid an arm and a leg, but it was worth it. I think it was worth it. And then for the second mouse, within the 14-day, also complete disappearance of the tumor. And the third mouse, and again, with the second mouse, stop treatment, keep the mouse alive, just give it food, right? Just don't mess with it. And then the last mouse actually did see like a very, very steep increase in tumor growth for the first week and a half, and then dramatic decline in growth, right? And then it reached to the point where when they implant the tumor, they do like a little incision on the skin of the mice, and then they basically like put the cancer cells in there. So it forms a little bit of a scar, or at least a swelling, right? So after about the last mouse that actually had a tumor growth, and it went back to the original size. So within about 10 days, or at least 14 days, the only thing that was left was the initial scar where the cells were implanted. But that scar didn't disappear, while in the first two mice it did. So I thought, the lab said, oh, we have a full cure. Let's kill the study. I'm like, no, not so fast. I don't like the bump that's still in the skin. Let's see what happens if we keep it there. So they stopped the treatment, right? And then basically that last mouse started getting a little bit of regrowth. So basically that thing was increasing. So maybe some cancer cells probably still left there. So they reintroduced the treatment. Tumor regressed completely. So even the scar disappeared. And then we stopped the treatment again. And I think the treatment, the last mouse had a full tumor regression at around day 60. And then I told him, okay, stop the treatment, all 3 mice, continue until day 78. And then there was no recurrence of the tumor. And at that point, you can keep it for as long as you want, and you can argue that at some point, maybe later, the tumors will reappear. But in terms of a percentage of the mice lifespan, that period of time is equivalent to way more than 4 or 5 years, which is what is required in humans to be declared cancer, to be cured, right? So if you have cancer and you get treatment for the first 5 years, you're declared in remission if you respond, right? If you don't respond, then it's bad. But if you respond, let's say tumor disappears, or at least it's not detectable, they say you're not cured, you're in remission. So for 5 years, we're going to be doing these regular checkups every 6 months or every 3 months, or however often the oncologist wants. And if there's no recurrence after 5 years, we're going to declare you cured. Well, that period of time that all the mice endured without treatment and without recurrence of the tumor exceeds that 5-year period. So then, of course, I'm paying to the lab to monitor these mice. So at the day 78, they said, "Hey, look, we like getting paid doing nothing, but like, are you sure? Like, you sure you want to continue?" I said, "Well, you should meet the politicians here in Congress. I think they can teach you a thing or two." Anyway, so we stopped the study at day 78, and then I started doing a follow-up study, which is already ongoing. There is a analog of aspirin known as 2,6-dihydroxybenzoic acid, with basically it's a much more acidic, much more lipophilic, and also a carbonic anhydrase inhibitor. So I had again, one of Ray's comments was that basically because the cancer cell is very alkaline, it has a high pH. Usually, if a cell is metabolically deranged and it cannot be reverted back to normal, the organism will send a signal and it will ask the cell to basically undergo apoptosis, which is like the controlled suicide, right? But that process in cancer cells is somehow blocked, and nobody knows why. Ray's comment was that it's actually very simple. It's all controlled by pH. If you can drop the pH of a cancer cell back into the acidic range, or at least where the healthy cell is, then basically if the cell is deranged, it's going to undergo apoptosis. And if it's not that damaged, it's going to revert back just to normal cell. There's no cancer structure in the cell. And one of the confirmations of Ray's comments on that was that the drug acetazolamide, which is a carbonic anhydrase inhibitor, increases basically the levels of carbon dioxide in the cell by preventing its breakdown. It has displayed some remarkable, they call it preclinical effects, because it's not used on humans yet, but in animals, various animals models, on multiple tumor types. And nobody knows what the mechanism of action is. Well, Ray's explanation was simple. Because carbon dioxide is a Lewis acid, it's actually an acid. It acidifies the cell, drops the pH. So if the cell is really damaged, it undergoes apoptosis. So I said, okay, let's try something that's stronger acid than carbon dioxide, and it's easier to administer because it's actually a powder. You can take it as a pill. Carbon dioxide is a little bit more difficult. You can do acetazolamide, but it's a drug. Most people don't know where to find it, and I think in many its price is rising. I don't know why. Maybe somebody already knows that it can have anti-cancer effects. So I said, let's take something. Amazing convergence of circumstances here. So it will be if I had found something that works, but it was really, really expensive, that doesn't really help humanity, right? All of these things that I tried are dirt cheap, unpatentable, and available everywhere, including this analog of aspirin, 2,6-dihydroxybenzoic acid. It's cheaper than aspirin. So I bought some from Sigma Aldrich, and I sent it to the lab in Taiwan, and I said, okay, let's do a follow-up study. We're going to do another group which has the 3 vitamins and aspirin, but I'm going to bump the aspirin dosage to about, human equivalent 1.5 grams. Let's make it to be 2 grams. I didn't like the fact that the third mouse had initial growth and then only then started declining. I thought we can do better. And since I've already tasted all the different doses of the B vitamins, I thought there isn't much wiggle room there to play, right? So I said, okay, maybe it's the aspirin that's the controlling factor. So follow-up study where one group has the vitamins plus a higher dosage of aspirin. One group where it's the 3 vitamins plus a much lower dose of that stronger acidic version of aspirin. In fact, there's an old study with rheumatoid arthritis where this thing obliterated people's rheumatoid arthritis in 24 hours at a dosage 10 times lower than the aspirin. So they gave the humans, in that study, they gave one group 8 grams of aspirin daily, and they also gave to the other group, also with rheumatoid arthritis, 800 milligrams of this 2,6-dihydroxy. So 10 times lower dose. And it was much stronger, even at the 10 times lower dosage in terms of removing the swelling, the fever, and also like the inflammatory biomarkers such as erythrocyte sedimentation rate. So I said, let's try it. Maybe it is aspirin, but better, or 10 times stronger. So, if the dosage in the animals was basically 500 milligrams per kilogram, the 2,6-dihydroxybenzoic acid was 50 milligrams per kilogram. And then a third group, which had only aspirin and the stronger acidic analog. And then another group had only the 2,6-dihydroxybenzoic acid by itself. This study is still ongoing. The group that had only the 2,6-dihydroxybenzoic acid is already cured without the vitamins. The aspirin and the 2,6-dihydroxybenzoic acid, it's not doing, it stopped the growth, but we're not seeing regression yet. The vitamins with the aspirin and the vitamins with the 2,6-dihydroxybenzoic acid are kind of in between. So it looks like the 2,6-dihydroxybenzoic acid is working better than the aspirin because the 2 groups that have the vitamins and aspirin and vitamins and that new analog, the one with the new analog is actually getting closer to cure as well. But the one that only had the 2,6-dihydroxybenzoic acid by itself, it's already cured. So again, corroboration of the first result. I immediately got attacked on Twitter when I posted this. People were saying all kinds of crazy stuff like, oh, do you give in toxic doses? Of course you're going to kill the tumor. I'm like, well, why aren't the mice dying? And also like, what do you mean toxic doses? The LD50, which is the lethal dose that kills 50% of the animals, for all of these vitamins, it's like 10 times more than what I'm giving them right now. In fact, there are multiple clinical trials with B1 at the doses that I'm giving the mice for Crohn's disease, for Alzheimer's. In fact, for Alzheimer's, they were giving people a dose 10 times higher, and nothing happened. It's a non-toxic vitamin. I don't think it's possible to overdose on it. If you eat buckets of it, you may die from like an intestinal blockage, but you're not going to be able to get the toxic effects of that vitamin. So it can physically kill you, but not chemically.
Okay, hang on.
Yeah.
So with these studies, and Dr. Ray Peat, Warburg, Albert St. Georgi, I think it's really important that people understand the implications of this, because it's really freeing in terms of the ability of the body to heal, because, cancer sucks. It's complicated, but it's a big business in terms of the strategies that people are trying to take to cure cancer. And it's important to take this different mindset. The bioenergetic is a different mindset than the conventional system. In the bioenergetic mindset, cancer is a metabolic state. It is a state of the body that can be changed. And it is ultimately those cells have lost the ability to properly utilize glucose. And so then they excessively rely on fatty acid oxidation. They excessively rely on glycolysis. And so what Georgi has demonstrated in these studies and what we've talked about so far is when you give these cells the tools that it needs to relearn how to properly utilize glucose, we get more ATP, we get more carbon dioxide. The cell is able to regenerate and fix itself and change itself from a cancer state into a proper metabolic state, and the tumor goes away.
Yeah, so the two competing theories to this day, basically, and the one that Otto Warburg and Ray and everybody else before, it's called the functional theory or bioenergetic theory. In other words, look, the way that the cell behaves over time is going to change its structure. The allopathic version has always been is that now the cancer cell is an alien cell. You sit there, you do whatever you do over the years through random mutations. Eventually, one or more of your cells undergo a cancerous mutation. And after that happens, basically, there's nothing you can do for that cell to make it go back unless you do gene editing. And guess what? Now that's exactly what they're pushing. So basically, the allopathic version is once one of your cells becomes an alien cell, there are only two options: either you kill it first or it kills you. So the entire medical complex currently, as far as treating cancer, is not very different from the military-industrial complex, which is basically this famous expression, I forgot what it was like a colonel in Vietnam War. In other words, they asked him like, "Why did you destroy the village?" Well, to save it from the enemy. So the idea really of the current oncologic therapy is that we're going to give you something that we know is toxic for you, but we're hoping that we're going to kill the enemy before we kill you. And if we don't kill the enemy, then the enemy is going to kill you. So you have no choice here. The bioenergetic theory says, hold on a second. There's no plausible, neither evolutionary nor biochemical mechanism which would explain why your body would suddenly try to kill itself. This is complete crap. Nobody has explained that, right? Why hasn't cancer been weeded out evolutionary, considering that it's such a big evolutionary disadvantage? No response to that. Try to ask an evolutionary biologist. They'll shrug and say, hey, I don't lose my funding. Go and ask somebody else.
So then, along these lines, cancer being kind of like the extreme form of metabolic issues.
Yeah, diabetes type 1, indistinguishable. If you look into the cell, cancer cell and that type 1 diabetes person, you look at the metabolites they produce, which is mostly lactic acid. Look at the fact that their cells are overloaded with fat. So they have a lot of these lipid peroxidation byproducts. So PUFA is also involved, right? So indistinguishable. If I give you a culture of, let's say, a cancer cell line, you pick one, whatever you want, human cancer cell line, and then we take some sample from a diabetic person, put them into like these dishes that look identical, you will not be able to tell the difference between these two different cell types. They're identical metabolically.
So then you think back to, the 1800s, or maybe it was early 1900s, where the doctors were curing diabetes with, all rice diet.
Yes.
And
yes.
when you think about why that worked, it's because they restored proper glucose metabolism. There was no interference with excessive fatty acid oxidation.
Exactly.
They were limiting dietary fatty acid. And so those cells were able to relearn how to properly utilize glucose, and they cured the diabetes.
Actually, there's nothing to learn. They're capable. They didn't forget it. They're simply, so at any point in time, the cell can only metabolize what you supply it with. So if it's being oversupplied with fat due to the Randle cycle, and because the oxidation of fats puts the cell into a reduced state, the oxidation of glucose requires an oxidized state. So as long as the cell stays in this reduced state due to the oversupply and oxidation of fats, it simply cannot metabolize the glucose. But the apparatus is still there. So the moment you interrupt this vicious cycle of giving too much fat, which results in oxidizing too much fat, then the cell says, and then you give it glucose, of course, right? It says, oh, the other macronutrient that I can oxidize, give me that. And then everything goes back to normal. At least that's what we're seeing. Not only my study, I mean, this was the culmination in vivo of many previous experiments that have demonstrated partially that if you restore the oxidation of glucose, not just cancer, many different diseases completely disappear. Over the last 2 years, there have been studies, again, animal models, but in mice, that multiple sclerosis, not only its functional, its phenotype, which is the fatigue, the muscle weakness and whatnot, not only that disappears, but the lesions that are characteristic of people with multiple sclerosis, the demyelinating lesions that are seen on the spinal cord and brain, they also disappear. So the structural damage that you're seeing, so really Biotin says energy is at the core of everything. You interfere with the supply and production of energy, structure will start to crumble. Allopathic medicine says no, structure is at the core of everything. So if you have some kind of a disease, we have to look for the structural problem. And when it comes to cancer, they're saying the structural problem is an actual defect in your genes. In other words, you acquired a genetic defect, and unless we fix that defect, like a car, you get like a broken axle or something, and then medicine says no, unless we change that axle, man, you're not going to be able to drive that car. While bioenergetics says no, it's all about your gas. You're putting the wrong gas into the car. If we put the right gas into the car and basically restart the engine and make the engine work properly, then the axle is going to repair itself, because that's how the body is designed, to constantly repair itself. But like every effort in nature, it requires energy. And it just so happens that the oxidation of fats is a very slow process, and it's not good at providing the amounts of energy needed, like a burst of energy that they need to repair things. It's not a coincidence that the long distance runners and in general, like a long-term, low-intensity efforts, they rely predominantly on fat. Like your heart beating at rest burns predominantly fatty acids. But the moment you start overexerting yourself, your heart starts to kind of sputter, and depending on how healthy it is, you can get into a cardiac arrest, because you're not supplied now. The fat oxidation that the heart is used to is not sufficient to meet the energy demands of you exerting yourself. And there's a drug on the market, very old one, called meldonium, which inhibits the oxidation of fats. And this little process, when you take basically the inhibition of excessive fatty acid oxidation, when you're under exertion, the heart says, okay, I need more energy than the fats can provide me. So give me glucose. But you cannot oxidize the glucose because you're already having too much fat. But if you give this drug meldonium, which inhibits the oxidation of fat, the heart says, now I can oxidize glucose. Give me that glucose and I'll oxidize it. And that drug is now banned as a doping agent by WADA, the World Anti-Doping Association, because it has such a powerful pro-energetic effect.
Isn't that essentially what insulin is doing?
Exactly. But actually insulin works at a different point. Insulin inhibits lipolysis, so it kind of limits the oversupply of fat to the cell. This drug acts inside of the cell and says, okay, you may supply me with as much fat as you want, but if I block its oxidation, then okay, the fat will accumulate. It may have some negative effects long term, but as far as the cell is concerned, since you block the excessive oxidation of fat, then the cell will say, now I'm free to oxidize the glucose, so give me the glucose. And basically, everything's fine. And to confirm it, a recent study in 2019 with animal model with glioblastoma, another extremely deadly tumor, human one again, transplanted into mice, found that giving the mice meldonium, basically, the study for some reason didn't last long enough to see the full cure, but the curve looked very similar to mine. Just giving the mice meldonium. The exact same effects, the exact same principle behind the rationale of giving the vitamins that I'm giving plus aspirin. Aspirin works very similar to insulin. An old therapy for type 2 diabetes and even type 1 diabetes was something called sodium salicylate, which is the sodium salt of salicylic acid, which is the main metabolite of aspirin. If you type on Google sodium salicylate for diabetes, you're going to get studies from the 1890s and the early 1900s, like 1905, 1908. We're giving patients 6 to 8 grams, kind of like for rheumatoid arthritis, giving these patients 6 to 8 grams of sodium salicylate obliterate their diabetes like it never happened.
Okay, I think we should clarify a few things for our audience. So the first thing is like this state that cells are in. Georgie brought up the word reductive stress. And so it's important to remember that the food that we consume is essentially just like high energy electrons. And ideally, like that's a lot of energy. It can be really damaging. But the way that good metabolism works is that those electrons are flowing very quickly through the electron transport chain all the way to the end oxygen and
ATP.
We get ATP and we get carbon dioxide. And so we want those electrons to flow well.
Yeah, as quickly as possible.
Yes. When we're in reductive stress, there's a block. And so the electrons build up. And in order to have good electron flow and not have that block, we need a high NAD plus to NADH ratio. And so I think it's helpful to understand why the B vitamin supplementation has helped repress these tumors that you've seen in the studies, because vitamin B3 helps increase that NAD plus, which then gives more electron carriers to help move those electrons through.
Right.
But then I'm still confused.
It also limits lipolysis, similar to insulin. So you're going to get less of a blockage of the oxidation of glucose to start with, right? Because one of the real cause of the blockage, so to speak, there could be many causes. You can get a metabolic toxin, which blocks one or more of these steps. In fact, the rotenone is a very known one. They use it in the lab to create these blocks artificially. But the main block that most of us have on a daily basis is driven as a result of stress, which increases lipolysis, right? We'll get too much fat supplied to the cell. As soon as you get the too much fat supplied to the cell, you're going to have a block of the oxidation of glucose, at the very least, at the level of pyruvate dehydrogenase, right?
So pyruvate dehydrogenase is like this gatekeeper of are we going to use carbs or fats? And a very important, PDH needs a lot of B vitamins, right?
Yes.
It's not just one.
The cofactors of the cofactors of B1 and magnesium, but also another controller is the NAD plus to the NADH ratio.
Okay. Yep.
So really what you need to be doing is giving a lot of B1 and magnesium if possible, right? And also giving niacinamide to give the NAD plus, to raise the NAD plus to the NADH ratio. Simultaneously, by giving the niacinamide and raising the NAD plus to the NADH ratio, you'll be supplying less of a fat. So that block will be weaker or non-existent altogether, right? And then biotin actually it can circumvent completely pyruvate dehydrogenase. Let's say these cancer cells in such an advanced reductive state that basically they're oxidizing 100% fatty acids, pyruvate dehydrogenase is fully blocked. Then there is an alternative pathway called pyruvate decarboxylase, where basically can take pyruvate that's coming from glycolysis. And biotin is a cofactor for that enzyme. And it can take pyruvate, and instead of letting it accumulate, which creates lactate, then takes pyruvate, processes it, and enters it into the Krebs cycle at another state as something called oxaloacetate.
It's a detour. It's a detour around the construction site. We've got an accident at PDH.
You got a broken bridge, right? Completely broken.
Yeah. Biotin helps a little detour path.
A detour, yeah. Another bridge.
Okay.
So basically, in a very reduced state, you can have the bridge, let's say you had 4 lanes. And the more you're getting blocked from too much fat, you get shrinking down to 3 lanes, 2 lanes, 1 lane, right? And then no lanes, all lanes are blocked. And you can even, in very extreme states, the entire bridge can collapse. So these scars, which are really the pyruvate coming from glucose, right? Oxidation of glucose, you enter glucose through glycolysis, go through 6 or 7 steps, and then it spits out pyruvate. But that's all done outside of the mitochondria. Cancer cells are almost entirely producing their energy outside of the mitochondria. The mitochondria is dysfunctional. That's what led Otto Warburg to say something's wrong here, because we're seeing this in hypoxic states where oxygen is not available, and then cells functionally revert back to glycolysis only. But then when we restore oxygen, then their mitochondrial respiration is restored. He's saying cancer cells, when I look at them structurally, they have nothing wrong with them, but for some reason, once they decide to become cancer cells, and we give them oxygen, they don't revert back to normal. But he said it still is metabolic. I don't see any structural damage to them. So he didn't know at the time there is this enzyme, pyruvate dehydrogenase, and it can be blocked. So if it gets blocked or completely destroyed, the bridge collapses, then pyruvate, the cars will accumulate, right? And at some point, they'll probably start falling into the river because there's too much of an accumulation. You're always eating, there's always food coming in, right? So biotin will take some of these cars and, route them through an alternative bridge, and then that later area after the bridges is known as the Krebs cycle, which is now part of the mitochondria. Once you enter the mitochondria, then usually all things are fine. Very rare diseases, genetic ones, have damages to one of the enzymes of the Krebs cycle, right? But these diseases are so severe, most people don't survive beyond the first year after birth. So it's chances are you don't have that, okay? If there's any issue, it's deficiency of a cofactor or whatnot. Otherwise, you wouldn't make it past 1 year of age. And then there is potentially another blockage that can happen at the electron transport chain, right? But it can also be reversed. Usually the big block is at complex 1, which is dependent on the NAD plus to the NADH ratio. So by giving niacinamide, you're also unplugging that block as well. And finally, there can be, commonly blocked at complex 4, which is known as cytochrome C oxidase. In people in extremely stressed state, they produce a lot of nitric oxide. And nitric oxide, a lot of bodybuilders and sports people take it because it's a vasodilatory molecule. It's also highly inflammatory, and it mimics the poisoning with carbon monoxide. It binds cytochrome C oxidase. And then these electrons, even though, let's say everything was going great, there was no blockage at PDH, They went through the Krebs cycle, then complex electron transport chain 1, 2, and 3. They reach 4, and then 4 cannot take those carbs. So again, a buildup happens as well. Same pathological states result from that.
Isn't one of the best things to remove that bridge? So basically, if someone can think about this, I really like we've got this 6-lane highway, and our body has all these pathways to be able to utilize glucose, get things into the mitochondria, all the way to oxygen, generate ATP, generate endogenous CO2 levels. But, as more and more things pop up, we've got okay, that lane is closed, that lane is closed, that lane is closed, that lane is closed. But once we get inside the mitochondria, and you said, nitric oxide can block cytochrome C oxidase,
which is complex 4.
Isn't one of the best things to remove nitric oxide, red light therapy?
And methylene blue. Yes.
And
the only two things that can break that bond known, like that bond between nitric oxide and the complex is covalent, not ionic. So basically it forms, so in other words, it's permanent unless something can dislodge it.
Yep.
And two things that are known to dislodge it are red light and methylene blue.
And you get a lot of red light from sunlight. That's like free therapy, but red light therapy is also beneficial. So essentially, in my eyes, this is very reassuring for someone, because if we help reopen those lanes, then the body can then relearn how to use glucose, create more ATP, and
not
then
relearn, not relearn. All we need to do is unblock the roads. The roads are still there, right?
That's
so
right.
The relearning will be the equivalent of somebody destroying the bridge, and it can happen. It's been shown that excessive reductive stress can cause the cells to start to dismantle some of the mitochondrial machinery, such as complex 1, because they're saying, well, if I'm not going to use the mitochondria, maintenance of this mitochondria, all of the enzymes and whatnot, requires a lot of energy, right? So I'm going to start, first I'm going to stop using them, and over time the body says, I don't need these chunks of, matter floating around here. I don't need them. I'm only using glycolysis. And once that process starts in a very extreme advanced state of cancer, you can have a cell that's basically almost entirely glycolytic, and it does not have the machinery. But even in that extreme case, the bridge is totally collapsed. Or actually, let's say it's a flexible bridge, and it goes like this and touches the river. It's still there, okay? So all you have to do to restore the bridge at its normal state is shift the cell back into the oxidized state, and then everything is restored back to normal. Even if it's deconstructed, the cell can construct it again. All it needs is energy.
Okay, so this kind of questions the utilization of keto, because we're actually creating some insulin resistance there, because you're literally not consuming carbohydrates.
Yeah.
But you reflect back to the 1800s, our ancestors were eating somewhat of a mixed diet.
Sure.
Carbohydrates and fats, largely saturated fats. So there's been this huge increase in cancer and all these metabolic disorders. What has been the main reason why people have developed these blocks in utilizing glucose? What has been?
Yeah, I was going to say we should talk about what the blocks are.
Dietary, which leads us into the omega-3s. There's one of the biggest blocks, actually.
Oh.
But I don't know why people would take them, considering that they are a major block at multiple steps of the pathways to the oxidation of glucose.
Would you say that omega-3 is worse than omega-6? Yeah,
the only thing that they have, their saving grace is that if they don't peroxidize before you ingest them, and they actually mostly peroxidize, that's why they smell so bad. If they don't peroxidize and you ingest them in their intact form, and they manage to stay non-peroxidized, given that the body temperature is pretty high, right? They oxidize very easily and spontaneously. If they manage to somehow get in an intact form to the cell, there are these enzymes called cyclooxygenase and lipoxygenase. They can take as an input either omega-3 or omega-6. And the output are highly inflammatory substances known as prostaglandins and leukotrienes. And inhibitors of these enzymes are very famous and successful clinical drugs. Aspirin is a very famous one, but they have other ones like all the non-steroid anti-inflammatory drugs and the NSAIDs. They're all inhibitors of either COX or LOX or both. But the saving grace of omega-3 is that, okay, if you're eating a high PUFA diet, let's say mostly omega-6, they're going to get to these enzymes and going to be producing a lot of inflammatory mediators. You'll be in a state of chronic inflammation. The output from these enzymes, when omega-3 is used as an input, are much less inflammatory. So that's why in clinical studies that have shown, probably, and that's probably what explains, is that when they've looked only at inflammation, you can actually get lower inflammation by switching from omega-6 to omega-3. But if you follow these people long enough, you will see that they have a much higher risk of cancer and neurodegenerative disease, especially of the brain, when you're overloading on the omega-3s.
I have a really cool quote from a research paper. The PMID, if someone's interested, is 336-70710. And it says, quote, however, the use of the term anti may not be the best description of these effects. Anti means opposed to. Most effects of omega-3 PUFA on inflammation result from suppression rather than opposition of inflammation. N3 suppresses the production of transcription factors and cytokines involved in inflammation and produce less inflammatory eicosanoids.
Exactly.
They do not produce mediators which oppose the actions of inflammatory cytokines. So examples of the anti-inflammatory effects of DHA and or EPA include suppression of the production of numerous inflammatory mediators. So
you produce less, but you're still producing them. But if it's predominantly saturated fats, not only they're not inflammatory by themselves. By the way, the really nasty thing about the polyunsaturated fats, both omega-3 and omega-6, is that even in their intact state, without going through these enzymes, they themselves are endocrine disruptors because they are estrogenic. I posted a study recently on my blog that linoleic acid, which is the primary dietary PUFA in the diet, is actually itself it's indistinguishable from estradiol. It binds to the estrogen receptor, both alpha and beta, and acts as a full agonist, weaker than estradiol, but you're also ingesting in amounts massively more than the estradiol that you're producing. So the size does matter in this case. And basically, if you're eating all of this PUFA, you're getting the exact same effects as estradiol, even though your endogenous levels of estrogen may be low or normal, and you may not have an estrogenic problem. So they are endocrine disruptors even in their intact state. And if you allow them to go through the machinery, they also create inflammation. One of them being more inflammatory than the other, but both unarguably, both of them are pro-inflammatory. Just the omega-3 is slightly less so. And that's why I think the studies are very devious when they try to test for inflammation and whatnot. They say, oh, we get these people, they're in a highly inflamed state. We check their biomarkers, high erythrocyte sedimentation rate, high levels of prostaglandins, NF-kappa B, TNF alpha, and then we gave them 3 grams of fish oil daily. And then after 2 months, all these biomarkers were down. What they neglect to mention is that the markers did not normalize. Yes, they're down, right? But they're still, let's say, 2 times higher than the range where they should be. Saturated fats don't have these effects. In many cases, they have direct anti-inflammatory effects.
So for the audience, it's important to remember, fat isn't fat. Different types of fat have different biochemical structures. And so, of course, they're going to be utilized differently in the body. Saturated fat has no double bond.
Yeah.
Whereas MUFA has 1 double bond. And then, the term PUFA is very popular these days, but people don't realize that the term PUFA means omega-3 and omega-6. Omega-6 is commonly talked about.
Yeah, and even omega-9, but some of them are non-inflammatory. Like if you completely remove all of the omega-6 and omega-3s from your diet, eventually you're going to start to producing something called meat acid. And if you look at meat acid, it is a polyunsaturated fat, but it's an omega-9. And it can still go through the cyclooxygenase and lipoxygenase enzymes, but the output is anti-inflammatory, not suppressive of inflammation, but directly anti-inflammatory. So it kind of demonstrates directly that if you remove the PUFAs completely out of your diet, you're moving direction, not simply for less inflammation, but so it's like if you look at the interval 0, -1 to +1, right? Let's say the negative is being bad. So omega-6 will put you at the -1 point. Omega-3 will put you at -0.5, right? You're still inflamed, but less so. And then 0 will be 0 inflammation. When you have complete removal of the polyunsaturated fats and you're producing meat acids, you'll be moving towards +1. So it's much better. So it's not just a removal of inflammation, but actually direct anti-inflammatory effects, preventing inflammation from even occurring.
So I think it's important for people to realize these quote essential fatty acids, so omega-3, omega-6, the bioenergetic space kind of questions the whole essentiality of them, because when you go to the literature and you find the studies demonstrating the essentiality, it's by this professor named Dr. Burr, William Burr.
Yeah.
What he actually demonstrated is that when you remove PUFAs from the diet, the metabolic rates of these mice were so high that they then started to struggle because they weren't getting enough B vitamins, because a strong metabolism requires those B vitamins, like we talked about, to move electrons through the mitochondria. And so he actually demonstrated a B vitamin deficiency rather than the essentiality. And so it kind of ties this all back together. Those mice didn't have enough B vitamins to properly oxidize glucose. So of course they ran into problems because they were missing certain cofactors.
Yeah, exactly.
And so PUFAs there's been a huge increase in PUFAs. You know, the fish oil industry is like a huge, big business. I want to say that the projection of like 2024 for the business is, I have it written down, it's expected to be 5.58 billion in 2020 was the size of the omega-3 supplement industry, and it's expected to grow by 9% through 2028.
Wow.
And so like this is big business.
So we should invest in that instead of the stock market.
I guess so. And so dietary PUFA, there's been a huge increase in dietary PUFA over the last 100 years. But what are some other things that have caused these blocks in the roads of someone not being able to utilize glucose?
Chronic stress. As soon as your cortisol rises, basically cortisol itself increases lipolysis and directly blocks pyruvate dehydrogenase and I think complex 2 of the electrotransport chain just by being just by having high cortisol in your blood. So really cortisol, the role of cortisol is to tell your body, stop doing what you're doing. We have to survive, right? And the survival really means, cortisol is going to destroy a lot of your lean tissue and bones and many internal organs to turn them into amino acids. And then these amino acids, then will get converted to glucose into the liver. So it's like an emergency supplier of energy when this energy is not coming from food. And in fact, if you supply it through food while being high stress and high cortisol, because the body says it has this excessive supply of energy, cortisol turns on an enzyme called fatty acid synthase. So if you're eating a lot while you're stressed, and a lot of people are, and I think it's like one of the, what is it called? The hungry, the stress munches or whatever. Yeah. So if you're eating a lot of food while you're stressed, that's why you're getting you're gaining weight. Is because the cortisol is preventing you from oxidizing that food, from turning it into energy. While cortisol is there, basically it turns out that mitochondrial metabolism is in effect a luxury, because it's with something that only works well when we're not stressed, when we're getting sufficient sunlight, right? We're getting sufficient sleep. We're surrounded by people that we like. We're not, so which basically the stranger effect is a very strong stressor. And since many of these things, if not most, are now gone, we're in a state of chronic stress, low grade, but still chronic stress. And some people, extreme. But for most people, it is a constant low grade chronic stress. There is a procedure in animal research known as CUMS, CUMS, and it's known as chronic unpredictable mild stress. It's a very reliable procedure and protocol for inducing depression, psychosis, diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, whatever you name it, is already admitted by the animal research industry, actually research industry, which works on animals but also humans, that all you need to do to recreate most of the degenerative disease that we're seeing these days, all you have to do is create a low-grade but constant stress for the animals. And they're immediately seeing a decline in their metabolic rate, and this buildup of electrons, which is how the bioenergetic theory explains it, leads over time to structural issues. And virtually every chronic disease you can name, actually even the infectious ones, you subject the animals to CUMS, then they're much more susceptible to viral infections, bacterial infections, fungal infections, and not only susceptible, they're much more likely to die from those infections. Conversely, if you deplete the animals of PUFA and they get into a so-called essential fatty acid deficient state, they become almost impervious. Not only they don't develop any of these diseases, they become almost impervious to getting these diseases induced in them. I did an interesting experiment related to the cancer study. I said, let's test the fat-free diet and see what happens to cancer. So I asked the lab to take, again, 3 mice and put them on a completely fat-free diet for 3 weeks. And then I said, try to inject them with the cancer cell line, the JCO1 line, basically, without any treatment. They could not get the tumor to hold on to the mice. I can send you that study.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And something Ray was saying for decades, saying like, well, look, I don't know. I mean, like, I guess it's arguable whether complete depletion of PUFA will cure your cancer if it's already there or not. But there's very strong evidence that essential fatty acid deficient animals are highly resistant to radiation, to dosages that will kill a normal animal, highly resistant to toxins, including lipopolysaccharide, which is the endotoxin, but also many other toxins that will normally kill: cyanide, anthrax. They will basically kill a normal organism. The essential fatty acid deficient animals were very, very resistant to that, and including cancer. So I said, well, the cancer hasn't been tested. Let's try it out. And after these animals became fatty acid deficient, first of all, we did not see the symptoms that the birds did see, such as the cracked skin, like the emaciation. We did not see that. So there is I don't want to call that study fabricated, but I did not see that in my study. And it lasted about 4 weeks. Maybe it wasn't long enough. Maybe I'm now forgetting how long did the bird
spend more money, Georgie. Spend more money.
Yeah, exactly.
Longer. So we've got, excessive PUFA consumption in the diet because it's kind of unavoidable if you're, eating out, fast food, high cortisol.
Endocrine disruptors, other endocrine disruptors that are all around us. Now the plastics,
so environmental toxins, plastics,
lack of red light. Like we're now mostly under fluorescent light. I'm sitting in this office, and this light is supposed to be mimicking the sun, but I have this chronometer, basically not chronometer, but chromatograph. And when I point it to the light, it says basically the blue spectrum is 60% of the light. So that's nothing compared to the sunlight. And it's advertised as a good replacement of sunlight. Nothing like it.
Yeah. So we've got high PUFA diet, stressed out, staying indoors, not enough sunlight, a lot of environmental toxins like plastic, because those actually increase reductive stress as well.
The endocrine disruptors in plastics, they work exactly like some of the steroids you have. So they are very highly estrogenic. So they perfectly mimic the estrogen in the body. They're anti-thyroid. They act as thyroid receptor antagonists directly. And those drugs are known to be really, really bad. They only give them to patients with thyroid cancer, and even then it's not a cure. They're also anti-androgenic. So they cause sterility, not for infertility. They can cause sterility in males. And a lot of people thought, okay, in males, it's bad enough, but it's only males. No, actually, androgens are very important for females as well. If you fully block, if you give females an androgen antagonist drug, females cannot conceive, not to mention no sexual desire whatsoever, which disproves the fact that it's estrogen really driving that. It's actually androgens for both males and females. It's just the right balance and ratio that really, so that what makes them a female is the ratio of androgens to estrogens. And then in males, again, it's androgens to estrogens. Old study that I found that said males produce about 45 to 50 micrograms of estradiol daily. And if they didn't produce androgens, and I think that has been tried, they can grow breasts that can make, any Victoria's Secret model jealous.
Doesn't, I think I wrote down here, you posted a study that omega-3s actually can degrade androgen receptors. So exactly. That's not very good.
So so not to mention that the follow-up study which said they can also bind the estrogen receptor and act exactly like estradiol. So not much difference between PUFA in the diet and the things we're getting from plastics. Now, I think a lot of people would agree that there's something about plastics that I don't want to eat them, right? You definitely don't want to. They're not appetizing. Well, guess what? The PUFA you're eating is not much different than the leachables from the plastics.
And so essentially we're in this environment that's so unnatural for human biology that it's like putting up all these barriers, inhibiting us from utilizing glucose. And I think it's important for people to realize that people with diabetes, they don't only have high blood glucose, they also have very high levels of fat in their serum.
Yes.
And they are increasingly relying on fatty acid oxidation much more than the average person. And so we're in this like different metabolic state. It's not like we've completely changed the body. It's just that the cells are in a different metabolic state due to environmental exposures and the changes in the diet.
Yep.
And so I really like to look at like 1800s, early 1900 cookbooks to see what our ancestors were eating. And they ate kind of a mixed diet. And so I like that type of, I like to eat that way. Like I love sourdough bread with just like a big thing of butter on it. A big glass of like whole raw milk. Like They lived in a slightly different environment. And so that type of diet is achievable if you have a good metabolic rate. Would you argue?
Yeah, of course. And also like basically, I think you guys are lucky to live like kind of like away from the big cities. There's something about big cities that's like, I don't know, incrementally toxic. And in fact, if you look at the literature in the early 20th century, everybody was admitting, and even back in industrial England, the whole point of cities, they were detested, they were hated. People kind of sensed that living in the city is not good for you, but it was good for the factory. You're basically concentrating a large amount of people to live very close to the factories. And that was the whole purpose of the cities, of the big cities, right? And now that the industrial basically the industrialization is kind of gone, then basically a lot of the cities are kind of saying, okay, so why are we here? And you're seeing a lot of crime. It's not a coincidence that crime is higher in the cities. It's not just the high concentration of people. If you look at per capita, crime is still higher in the cities, even though it's normalized for the population. Something about living in more rural areas, having more open spaces, I don't know, interacting with nature. Because if you have more open space, even in the city, you're going to be interacting with nature. Yeah, concrete maybe, asphalt and whatnot, still nature. But when you're stuck in these cubicles and they have these like nervous people running around you all day, I don't think most people would argue this is good for your health.
Yeah. If anyone's wondering, we have a lot of things going on here, and something just happened, so Sarah had to go take care of it. But she'll be back. So all of this is a little bit depressing, kind of, because it's almost hard to be healthy in modern times. And so if we go back to what your mouse studies were showing in the beginning, how do you think someone should restore proper glucose utilization? And I think it's important for people to understand, and this is kind of my interpretation, but having a good metabolism is synonymous with being able to utilize glucose.
Yes.
You have to be able to utilize glucose to have a good metabolism.
And to have good health, ultimately.
Brad Marshall has talked about this very popular quote from like very early medicine, and it was fat burns in the flame of carbohydrates. And so it's this idea that your body, when you eat a mixed meal, insulin's going to rise because you're eating carbohydrates in that meal. Insulin's going to rise so that your cells can use that glucose. It can pull the glucose out and use it. And then the fat is used later on in the day. Like, people forget that there's 24 hours in the day, and our metabolism should be able to utilize all these different macronutrients unless we're in this very reductive state and we have all these blockages. And so, of course, if there's no pathway for the glucose to go down, it's just going to sit in the bloodstream, high blood sugar, high insulin. No one is saying that that's good, but restoring metabolism and having high body temperatures, being able to regenerate tissues, that requires the proper utilization of glucose. And unfortunately, that people have, I'm going to reframe how I say it, because I normally say people have lost that ability. There's just barriers that have been put up.
There are way too many barriers. And something that was done in the old days, when you're eating predominantly saturated fat, even if it's mixed with a lot of glucose, which a lot of even Peterians will say, well, the Rendell cycle still exists. And basically, if you're eating a lot of both, you're going to be gaining weight. That wasn't the case back in the day. And one explanation is that because when people eating predominantly saturated fat, even when you're eating it together with the glucose will probably preferentially get oxidized, and then that fat will sit for later processing. But because they were lean and because the saturated fats were not endocrine disruptors, so let's say you run around during the day, you utilize mostly glucose when you're under exertion, and then when you go back home and start relaxing and go through the night, that fat that you ate during the day will get processed because your muscles at rest prefer to burn fat.
It's like an Amazon fulfillment center where like you put fat on the shelf, and then later in the day that fat gets like taken off the shelf to be able to use for energy. We're constantly pulling from energy stores, breakdown, like it's constantly happening.
Exactly. And it can, and it's designed to constantly happen as long as these micronutrients that we're eating, they're not interfering with the metabolism, with metabolism in general. So that happens only if the fat is predominantly saturated, how it used to be, right? So even if you look at the ads, the housewife ads from the 40s and 50s, have you seen like the people, they were feeding their children 4 to 5 meals a day. They were like ridiculously calorie rich. Like they had milkshakes and ice cream for breakfast.
Women were eating 3,000 calories very commonly.
Yeah. And it was mostly foods that these days are considered comfort foods and they should never touch or touch very rarely, right? And there was no such rates of obesity and whatnot. So what I'm saying is that if you're not overloaded with endocrine disruptors and stressors and all of these different factors that are blocking the lanes of the highway, you can get away with much higher caloric intake and you'll still not gain weight because your body has the machinery to actually process those calories. And when people were leaner, because your resting metabolic rate is determined primarily by the ratio of lean to fat mass. In other words, the higher that ratio, the higher your basal metabolic rate is. So basically what you really need to do these days is some people are doing it, the poor man's substitute, or like our unfortunate man's substitute that mimics the 1800s, early and 1900s, is people taking steroids to build much more muscle mass than it's normally, seemly for a normal human on the street, and that's how they compensate for the endocrine disrupting food that they're eating and all the other metabolic blocks they're having, by adding more metabolically active tissue in an artificial way, which is by lifting a ton of weights and injecting steroids. Nothing wrong with lifting weights, but lifting weights by itself will ultimately get you to a point where you can't really grow that much bigger unless you're doing the steroids, which are also used in the livestock industry for the same reason. So that's what bodybuilders have figured out, and it works, but with a lot of side effects, right? You don't want to be taking potentially hepatotoxic or cardiotoxic steroids just to compensate for the metabolic block that the norm of lifestyle has created. What really neat is for people to realize that the block is there. There are so many different things around us that are creating the block, and potentially focus on the major ones, because like you said, if you start chasing all of them, you'll probably lose your mind. It's just, there's so many that we don't even know about, right?
And there's so many things out of our control.
Exactly. But things like diet, right?
Yeah. Are these your tips, like tips to restore glucose utilization?
Or at least like keep it from turning into a chronic degenerative disease.
Yeah.
That's probably the most somebody living in the city like me can hope for. So a daily or like a couple of times weekly aspirin is enough. It's been shown that even if you take aspirin just twice a month, it will have a very strong cancer preventive effect for virtually all of the cancers that are out there. So even for people that are, kind of like, antsy about using aspirin, the doctor scared them off it, said, well, can cause bleeding or you don't need it and whatnot. Twice a month, okay? It's enough for cancer prevention. But if you can do it twice a week, it actually has a very strong preventive effect on diabetes, on cardiovascular disease, on Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease.
Now, Georgie, I don't do well with aspirin.
Okay.
And I have found that this to be the case for some other women.
Okay.
And I'm wondering if I just was trying to do too much at one time.
How are you taking and how much?
Just I feel like it was it Health Natura has the powder, aspirin powder. And I just was doing 500 milligrams.
Did you dissolve it?
I just, get it in, and
that's very dangerous.
Orange juice.
I was doing it myself, and somebody asked Ray on a radio call. He said, "You gotta be careful because even if one of those specks gets into your trachea and makes it to the lungs, you're gonna get an extreme reaction of it will feel like an intestinal irritation, but it's actually lung irritation. So salicylic acid is very irritating to the lungs. But when you take it as a powder, because the grains are so fine, chances are you'll get one or more to get into trachea. I've experienced this myself multiple times. I still take the powder, but I dissolve it in warm water. Or if you're, for the more adventurous, if you like liquor of some kind, you can take a shot. It dissolves much better in alcohol than it does in water. So you take a shot of cognac or a vodka or bourbon.
High quality alcohol.
Exactly, high quality alcohol. A shot of bourbon with a tablet of aspirin dissolved in it. It will work great.
All right, let me just catch her up. We're at the tips to restore glucose utilization. Okay, all right, Georgie, I don't like that you started at aspirin. And the reason being is I think that so many people are missing the foundations of I would say that, I guess you would argue that, aspirin is a big lever to move your health forward. But I'm talking like people aren't getting sunlight. People aren't eating the right food. People are fasting way too long every single day. So let's start with the basic foundations.
Sorry, what are we addressing?
Restoring
the ability to utilize glucose.
Okay, so removing the blocks of the road.
The only reason I started with aspirin is because I've actually had these questions from other people before. When I tried talking about red light, about being outside, about the changing diet and what, they're like, no, it's not gonna happen. Okay, give me something, a one shot thing that may help. And I said, it's not gonna.
People are looking for quick fixes, and you have to what you do every single day, your habits and what you eat impacts your health more than anything else. I
agree, fully agree. And I try. I said, listen, going out in the sun for 30 minutes is going to do more than what this aspirin is going to do. They're like, I don't have 30 minutes. I'm stuck in an office somewhere, and I can't leave. Even my cafeteria is in the building. So what am I going to do? All right, okay. Well, anyways, yes, be outside as much as you can. Study about 2 years ago posted on the forum that said that avoiding sunlight is worse than smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day. Think about that. Worse. Not similar. I can send you the link later. It's on the blog. Just type sunlight cigarettes, immediately comes up. It's hard for people to kind of like fathom this, but basically because they've been scared. Oh, he's going to have skin cancer. You're going to get wrinkles and whatnot. The skin cancer actually has been shown that, first of all, sunlight only increases the risk of the most benign of the cancers, which is basal cell carcinoma. Almost never lethal, and almost never grows beyond like that little spot that's on your arm. But also, it reduces the risk of getting melanoma, which is the deadliest form of skin cancer. And even if you get it, if you continue being in the sun, almost always prevents you dying from melanoma. So how about that? So, and by the way, most dermatologists actually live in this cognitive dissonance, because if you ask a dermatologist, where does melanoma usually form? They will invariably tell you in spots that rarely see sunlight. In other words, at the bottom of your of the soles of your feet, right?
Interesting.
Under arms, in your butt crack. Sorry to say that. Yeah, seriously, that's where most of the melanomas really reside. Maybe on the scalp, but for people who really like big hair, almost never on like fully exposed skin. That sees a lot of sunlight. Now, the basal and the squamous cell carcinoma, they almost invariably happen at areas that do see a lot of sunlight. But even then, basically, the basal cell one is benign, more or less benign. It's a malignant cancer, but it almost never grows to the point where it becomes a problem. It remains very localized.
Those cells are having problems with glucose metabolism.
Yes, they are.
And what's the reason?
Actually, the UV light in sun, and if you have a lot of PUFA stored in your tissues,
the PUFA,
they can cause the lipid peroxidation. You can develop localized cancer there. But if you deplete the PUFA, if you're eating less PUFA, if you look at the historical data, people are getting a lot more sunlight than we are these days. And the rates of basal cell, squamous cell, and let alone melanoma is almost unheard of. If you look at the literature before the 1950s, I think there's like only 1 or 2 published cases of melanoma. Some people say, well, that's because it was underdiagnosed. Yeah, but I'm not seeing cancer rates being very high at that time either, right? So it's not like we either diagnosing melanoma is actually what's causing people to die from it. Let's assume the melanoma rates were the same the same in the past as they are now. People weren't dying from it, and that's what counts. So either you admit that now that you're diagnosing melanoma more often, you're actually killing these people through the treatments, or we have to admit that back in the day, despite all the sunlight, right, people almost never got skin cancer. I think it could be both.
It's important to remember our skin is an organ, and it's our largest organ. And like if you pinch your skin, like there's a lot of fat in there. Mm-hmm. And we've literally changed the composition of our fat over the last 100 years. And so that fat is really close to your surface. So of course it's being exposed, and PUFAs are very unstable. And so would you say that the skin cancer, that's a form of actual damage to the machinery as opposed to the other types of cancer that we were talking about earlier?
No, it's not a damage, but it's like because there's so much PUFA there, basically when it's got hit by the UV light and creates these peroxidation byproducts of the PUFA, some of them are directly carcinogenic. So because the PUFA peroxidation byproducts are predominantly aldehydes, and almost all of the aldehydes are known human carcinogens. So you can get an actual cancer, but it's still not something that's causing your cell to genetically mutate. There may be mutations, but they're later down the road, and they don't much affect metabolism. It's just the fact that the PUFA is mostly concentrated there, and it gets hit by a catalyst, which is the UV light, right? And then you get this like, plethora of carcinogens floating around, but still largely localized there. You can get maybe basal.
If we think of these lanes, there's a literal car accident on this lane, and the cars are breaking all the bits.
A pile of cars, really, because the PUFA, which is basically, it's like kind of like concentrated there. So if you have like too many cars clustered and start climbing on top of each other, eventually you're going to have like a breakdown, like that lane will collapse of the bridge. Like if it has like 4 lanes, right? One lane may collapse. But then it can be quickly restored as long as you kind of limit the input of cars if the input is PUFA, right? Ray said this a long time ago. Not many people, I think, paid attention to. He said you can largely limit the effects of like sunburn out if you take an aspirin about an hour before going out in the sun. And the reason is that aspirin is also a PUFA peroxidation preventer. It acts like an antioxidant, but much more quickly than vitamin E. Another way to limit a lot of these effects of the potential bad effects of the sun is that if you take in sufficient amounts of vitamin E, because it gets stored mostly into the fatty tissue and your liver, over time you're going to have a sufficient amounts of vitamin E in everywhere in your body, including the lipid deposits under your skin. so that when the sun hits them, there will not be much of a peroxidation effect. And unsurprisingly, intake of vitamin E has been found to be inversely correlated with all of the three types, actually more than three, but the three major types of skin cancer.
And our ancestor, like vitamin E isn't, the USDA tests various foods and they just like assume that certain foods don't have vitamin E. So they just didn't even test for it. And our ancestors using, very like tallow and these natural animal fats, they actually do contain quite a bit of vitamin E.
Yeah, the two major stores of the liver and the fatty tissue. All of the fat-soluble vitamins can be found in one of those two areas. So if you're eating the organ meats and also like a lot of the collagen and skin and the fat and whatnot, you're getting a lot of vitamins that are not quantified currently in the literature.
Okay, so the first tip was to reduce PUFA consumption.
Yes, and expose yourself to sunlight. Even if you're loaded with PUFA and it somehow, God forbid, you get one of the cancers, it'll be the more benign and localized one, and actually you'll be reducing your risk of melanoma. And even if you get melanoma, you're reducing the risk of dying from melanoma the more you get exposed to sunlight.
And if someone does want to avoid potential burn, they could do sunrise and sunset where there's less UVB.
Or aspirin or vitamin E.
Okay.
Or niacinamide. Australian study, and they have very high rates of skin cancer. They also one of the countries with the highest consumption of PUFA. Not as high as Israel, which has the highest one, and it's also subject to a study called the Israeli paradox. The country with the highest consumption of polyunsaturated fats, specifically omega-6, has the highest rates of cancer in the world. So type the Israeli paradox in Google. Study immediately comes up. Several studies come up. Yeah. And they also get a lot of sunlight exposure, but they don't eat the antioxidants. They have very low intake of vitamin E, and I think they have pretty low intake of aspirin. I mean, it's considered a drug there, so not many people take it.
Okay, so then in terms of dietary like macronutrient split, do you think that someone does need to limit their dietary fat in order to
just shift the ratio? Eat more butter. Like, so if you know you're going to be intaking some PUFA, and you will be if you're eating commercial food, when you go home, just like a spoon of MCT or coconut oil, it's good. It's very good at changing the composition over time of your tissues, and also because when you're eating the meal, you get a so-called hyperlipemic response because that fat is going to take some time circulating around your bloodstream, getting processed by the liver and your tissues, and either stored or oxidized, right? That actually turns out that time period, so your levels of lipids are elevated above baseline for up to 12 hours after eating a meal with a decent amount of fat in it. So while this fat is circulating around, if it's predominantly polyunsaturated fats, whether omega-3 or omega-6, it's going to have a plethora of negative effects, one of which is suppressing your thyroid gland. So you're going to be you're becoming hypometabolic while this fat is circulating around. So just eating a slightly more, just an additional serving of saturated fat to change the ratio either 1-to-1 or slightly in favor of the saturated fat has been shown to largely prevent those bad effects of the PUFAs while they're circulating.
Yeah.
Simple. Something very simple. You don't have to stress yourself over it.
Fats also serve as signaling molecules. And so Georgie brings up a good point. The ratio is very important because more of one signaling molecule will outcompete the signaling molecules of others.
Exactly. Similar to the example that I gave with the androgens to estrogens ratio. It's not the absolute amounts. You can be like, they're often given the example of menopausal women having basically very low estrogen and progesterone, right? But if you look into the tissues, actually the estrogen is not declining. It stays the same or sometimes even rises. It's progesterone that declines. But even if you look into the blood, their levels are not zero. They're saying below the normal range they've defined as the normal range. But studies have actually looked at if there's any progesterone and estrogen left in the blood of the menopausal women. There is. The amounts are very low, but the ratio has shifted from 200 to 300 in favor of progesterone to actually 100 in favor of estrogen. So very low undetectable levels, but they still have effects on your tissues and organs. And it's the ratio now heavily in favor of estrogen. If there's nothing to oppose estrogen, then estrogen will dominate, right? And you're going to get these effects over time, regardless of the fact that the amount is tiny. So it's the uninterrupted effects of a low, kind of like a low activity factor that's really important, like kind of like the unpredicted stress. Chronic, unpredictable, mild stress, keyword. Because if the stress is extreme, two things happen. Either that human will lose his or her mind, do something crazy, go to jail, to a hospital, or snap out and leave, right? There will be some kind of a resolution, or the person will die from too much stress. It's really the chronic mild stress that's really pernicious, because you sense it's there, but you tolerate it because you're like, well, what is it, delayed gratification or whatever other crap they came up with. You need to tolerate it. No pain, nor gain. But that's true. Not always. It's true. But what they're trying to give you the hidden message, and most people have internalized, is that more pain equals more gain. That is certainly not true.
Okay. And then if someone was able to kind of better control their macronutrient split, maybe using chronometer. So you gave a tip of, if you are exposed to a lot of PUFAs, just do what you can to maybe compensate that with saturated fat. If someone were to be able to control their dietary intake and, track their macros on chronometer, what would you kind of suggest in terms of removing those blocks for glucose utilization? Like a split.
Something as simple as a 1 tablespoon of gelatin or collagen daily does wonders for many things.
Yeah.
For inflammation, for restoring glucose metabolism. There was a study with diabetics, which basically they were type 2 diabetics, hardcore. I think some of them were about to go on insulin therapy, so they were really uncontrolled diabetes. And then they gave them, I think, 6 grams of glycine, which is the predominant amino acid in gelatin. It's about 1/4, right? So this means that about 24 grams or 25 grams of gelatin is going to give you the same amount of glycine that this study did. So they gave the diabetics 6 grams of glycine, and basically then they gave them sugar, which normally creates this like big, they call it area under the curve for glucose, which means how much their glucose rises. And because they're obviously extremely insulin resistant, the glucose rises tremendously, the diabetic levels, and it stays there, right? Really bad stuff. But it's not the glucose, but that's a separate question. Then they gave him the glycine, and there was no glucose spike whatsoever. Basically, they remained almost as if they were fasted. I mean, their blood glucose was still high because diabetics have a high baseline glucose. That's what defines them as diabetics. But they did not get the glucose response. Something in the glycine acts similarly to insulin. That was the conclusion of the study. Or has some kind of a strong glucose oxidation promoting effect that it prevented the glucose response to a large glucose challenge, is what they call it in medicine.
Brad Marshall has mentioned that there's studies showing that glycine can remove the fuel buildup.
Mm-hmm.
So like those acetylated groups.
Yep.
It can actually like get rid of that reductive stress.
Yep.
So that's my view, is that glycine is literally helping just improve that NAD plus to NADH ratio, reducing that reductive stress. So again,
that's a great point. Mm-hmm. Actually, another ratio that's very important is basically the ratio of coenzyme A to acetyl coenzyme A. So when you have too many acetyl coenzyme A, that's a sign of reductive stress, and that ratio controls pyruvate dehydrogenase as almost as much as the NAD plus to the NADH ratio. So the Krebs cycle, the speed of the Krebs cycle, which is the first portion of the mitochondrial metabolism, depends almost entirely on the acetyl-CoA to CoA ratio, because that's the molecule that the Krebs cycle works with, acetyl-CoA. Let me just turn on the light.
True. I was like, what happened?
And so gelatin directly improves that ratio,
yes,
because it remove the acetyl-CoA?
Or I mean, either that or stimulates the production of more coenzyme A, with the cofactor for which is vitamin B5, which is probably another thing we want to mention. Another way to speed up your metabolism is basically provide more source for coenzyme A, and simultaneously, ideally, if possible, reduce the amount of acetyl-CoA. And in normal high-speed metabolism, the acetyl-CoA will be lowered simply because it gets consumed through the Krebs cycle. But if its Krebs cycle is not functioning for whatever reason, adding a little bit of glycine or maybe some of the other amino acids in gelatin, I think gelatin has been shown to have similar effect. I think it's not just glycine. Glycine is the most studied one, but the proline and hydroxyproline and the tyrosine, there's some other amino acids in gelatin. I think they have some of those effects as well. Tyrosine, a precursor to dopamine, a very known pro-metabolic agent. Recent study demonstrated that inhibiting the breakdown of dopamine, which basically raises its levels in the body, and they gave a specific drug which is known as monoamine oxidase type B inhibitor, can fully reverse already established obesity without any change in calories. So promoting dopamine. What promotes dopamine? Having fun, going out in the sun, having sex, but not scheduled. Like I was terrified. One of the people that emails me basically said, like, well, me and my husband are going to a therapist, and then we went to the therapist, and what did the therapist say? We guys need to, be intimate more often. And then she gave him a schedule. Okay.
Oh no.
So 2:15, come and rub my shoulders. 3:30. The
Oh,
other person
gosh.
does something. And I said, you know what? If I see this, I mean, sorry, but it's not making me feel amorous. I mean, how are you guys doing? She's like, we're not. So they stopped going to the therapist, but then she changed her job. Her husband also changed their jobs, basically much less, fewer hours, working hours during the week. They started going more on vacations. One thing leads to another. Now they have twins. And they were trying for a very long time, and it wasn't working. And they were to the point where basically the doctor was saying, both of you are infertile, and we don't know why. So basically, either in vitro or you have to adopt. And turn out that's just a metabolic block caused by stress.
Yeah, that happens a lot with people who are trying to conceive, is like the stress of just like having the schedule of having sex at this time. And then they're just so stressed that they can't.
Just think about it. Schedule it. Can you imagine? Like,
It's so
what time is it? I'm sorry,
Yeah.
guys. You guys have to finish. But
Can you
have to
imagine
run.
trying to put livestock on a schedule to try to conceive?
Well, yeah, not to mention they're not even paying attention to like the fertility, like the time of the month, because that's
We've
just
lost-
like not part of mainstream. So they're not even doing it at the right time. So the chances
lost
are
touch
very
with
low.
nature.
And then they go
a
right to
great sign
IVF.
that something is bad for you is that the moment it stops being fun.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point.
Even if it's a favorite activity. If it stops being fun, usually it's because you've overdone it or it's because it's planned. So the whole thing
Yeah.
of planning, it may work for work, but it shouldn't be that much part of your life, okay? So it should be as spontaneous as possible without, of course, becoming homeless and running around and not doing anything planned. That would be the other extreme.
Yeah.
But even those people, I know some homeless people that are right there in front of the building. They're in remarkably good health. The ones that don't have a substance abuse problem. The ones that are not abusing drugs or alcohol and whatnot, I think they're going to live to 100. I mean, I saw a guy who basically like he almost all year he walks on with nothing but his shorts on, barefoot, walks around city. Yeah, I mean he
Constantly
looks crazy,
grounding.
but grounding exactly, and also they're like there's a lot of nerve endings at the bottom of your feet until like if you walk for too long they become callous. So I think you kind of lose that. But multiple Chinese studies that are very high, they're very into acupuncture, and even Japanese ones. They develop even these special shoes that have these little like I don't know how to call them, like spikes there. They're not painful, but like you step in a certain shoe and basically it activates these specific acupuncture points. The Chinese and the Japanese are very big on like what's going on like at the bottom of your feet. There are like
Yeah.
multiple areas there, and they have an entire fields of acupuncture and acupressure that treat diseases by foot massage. Anyway, this guy's walking around barefoot, half naked all year. They feed him 3 times daily. The city provides free food. It's not the best of food, obviously, right? But that person is lean and he's in his 70s. And he walks around almost all day. No stress. He walks slowly. He talks to himself. But other than the mind issues, which I think are pretty understandable, he looks healthier than most 40 or 50-year-olds that I know.
Yeah.
So basically, if you're forced to do something, and we all are to some extent, but if it gets to the point where nothing is fun, that means life has become too routine, too unrewarding, and I don't mean financially, just too unrewarding
Yeah.
about the things that you do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So dietary, make sure you consume carbohydrates that agree with you. I would argue that when you're trying to relearn your ability to, well, not relearn, when you're trying to
unblock the metabolism, yeah,
the metabolism, keeping dietary fat to a moderate level is important. I don't think that just consuming fats in excess when you're in a bad metabolic state can be good, because then you're going to have high levels of fat in your blood and high levels of glucose.
Yep. If you can afford to go at an altitude, even that distinction will disappear. You can eat wherever you want.
Because high
Probably
CO2?
4,000 calories. Yeah.
High
Mm.
CO2.
Yeah, high CO2. Yeah.
And then what are your guys' thoughts on B vitamin supplementation? Truthfully, that's not something that I've really done much of. Sarah's experimented a lot more, but clearly, Georgie, your studies are documenting that there is pro-metabolic impacts of B vitamins because they're just important cofactors in all the steps of energy metabolism. But would you guys recommend people experimenting with B vitamins to see how they impact metabolism?
So because of stress, we're also excreting a lot more of the B vitamins when we're under stress. So several studies that have demonstrated that it's been known that if you drink alcohol, this dramatically increases your need for the B vitamins. Just the processing of alcohol requires B3 because the cofactor for both enzymes that process alcohol is NAD+. Yet another cofactor that requires B3, another enzyme. but also B1. So if you're drinking too much alcohol without supplying B1, you can get something called akin to something called beriberi disease, which is that people eat non-fortified rice, and it can have very severe neurological symptoms. So chronic alcoholics have something called often Wernicke-Korsakoff psychopathy or like encephalopathy. So they basically it's a almost type of it was considered a type of an insanity back in the day and was considered irreversible. But recently they found out that just supplying more B vitamins, B1, can actually reverse it. Anyways, if you're under chronic, unpredictable, mild stress, you're excreting about you have the same elevated excretion of B vitamins as in chronic alcoholics. And without the B vitamins, your nervous system and just entirely your energetic apparatus cannot work. So I wouldn't go overboard, but if you've been under stress, if your diet has been suboptimal, I don't think there will be harm in trying B1 and B3 specifically because they're such important cofactors. Trying a supplementation once or twice a week and see if that affects you. If the effect is major, right, then probably means you were deficient. And as you're supplementing more often, you'll probably start feeling like there's a plateau of benefits. And if you reach that plateau, you can probably stop for a while. Medicine keeps claiming that the B vitamins, they are water soluble, but medicine says, well, you have to take them daily because they don't build up. It's not true. I did an experiment with myself. I took B6 and B3, and then I did blood tests, and I took 500 milligrams of B3, which is high, but not that high. Most capsules on the market are 500 milligrams. And then I took 25 milligrams of B6, again high, but most of the supplements in local CVS and Rite Aid, they have 50 milligrams of B6 per pop. So I was taking half of that. So I took it for a week, and then I started doing blood tests a week after and a week after and a week after. The levels of B3 and B6 stayed above the upper limit of normal range for 4 weeks afterwards. So if you take in supraphysiological or pharmacological dosages of the B vitamins, you don't need to take them every day. They do build up. Or at the very least, you're reaching some kind of a saturation point, and they have some kind of a storage mechanism, probably in the liver, but potentially other tissues as well, where even if you stop taking them, these tissues can keep releasing the excess into the bloodstream, and you get a steady supply of these vitamins for at least a month, because I stopped doing afterwards because the levels declining to the normal range, so there was no point testing more. But yeah, even these relatively minor dosages, relative to what the blogosphere is recommending in terms of the B vitamins, taken daily for a week, kept my levels elevated for another 3 weeks afterwards. So actually 4 weeks afterwards. So you can try like maybe a couple of times a week and see if that helps you. If it does, I would keep taking them at the schedule. They're basically like so if taking every day provides a benefit, but then you reach a plateau, then I'll drop down to maybe 3 times a week and maybe 2 times a week. And I will take them at the schedule that is the least often that still produces benefit. I found that I can take B1 and B3 once a week, and that for me that's enough. But
when you say benefit, I feel like people just take things because Georgi on a podcast said that these are good.
Oh, okay.
How do people know if it's actually benefiting them?
One of the most unmistakable signs is reduced fatigue. At the end of the day, if you've worked like 10, 12 hours a day, most people will agree, even if they're in their 20s, they will be beat. They will feel exhausted and they will not have the desire to do anything. If it's due to one of these vitamins deficiency, and you take that vitamin and suddenly you perk up and you're ready to go, or at least things feel pleasurable. Anhedonia, which is the lack of pleasure from things around you, is one of the most reliable signs, again, of impending ill health. Not only depression, it's one of the core symptoms of depression. But what they don't tell is not only depression. Anhedonia is a reliable predictor of virtually the future development of virtually every chronic disease that we know, often decades in advance. So if you kind of lose your enjoyment of life, and this continues, in other words, the things that are causing it are still there, in 10 years, you'll probably have cardiovascular disease or potentially cancer or Alzheimer's. Definitely depression and probably other mental health issues as well. But lack of enjoyment of life is a very good predictor. And conversely, restoring the enjoyment of life, which I find to often happen with things like B1 and B3 or aspirin, it's a good indication that you're on the right track. Now, it doesn't mean that more is better. Again, like the more pain, more gain, same principle applies here. In fact, I said it's like you should take them as rarely as possible, but at the schedule that produces the biggest difference, the biggest delta, right? So if you're taking every day and you're getting minor benefit, That's probably less beneficial than if you're taking them twice a week, but every single time you take it, like, oh my God, I can, I work 12 hours, but now I have energy to go to a gym. That's, to me, the latter thing is better. It's indicative of a stronger benefit than taking every day for like a minor improvement in mental or physical health. So yeah, fatigue, sleep quality. Often when you're tired, you don't sleep well. You have to wake up. I know people that wake up 3-4 times at night, usually to go to the bathroom, which is indicative of high levels of stress hormones. But in general, low glycogen storage and low metabolism. Babies, most people that have been around babies know that babies, as soon as you give them sufficient food, they fall asleep. That's actually a sign of a good metabolism. And if eating, this amount of food makes you fall asleep and stay asleep, that's the key part, staying asleep. That's usually a good sign. And that's one of the first things you lose when you start going down the road of stress and ultimately, chronic diseases. So it's basically sleep quality declines. And there's all these drugs on the market now to ambient or whatnot to restore your ability to sleep. They don't restore your ability to sleep. They just knock you out. So it's, a step closer to being anesthetized, but it's definitely not healthy for you. Also, quality of dreams. If your dreams are really bizarre, if you have nightmares, but they don't have to be nightmares. If they're really bizarre in the morning, you wake up like, well, what the hell did you just dream about? That's a good indication that your serotonin levels are too high, and that's usually a sign of too much stress or sufficiently high metabolism, or deficiency of one of the cofactors that are producing dopamine, which is the opposite of serotonin. B6 is the cofactor for the production of both serotonin and dopamine, but its deficiency affects the synthesis of dopamine more. So discuss is what matters. So the ratio will shift towards serotonin. So taking a little bit of vitamin B6 often restores sleep quality and also the quality of dreams. Dreams will be pleasurable. They will not freak you out the next morning. So if you don't feel like marked benefit, however you define it, physical, mental, mood-wise, then you probably don't need those vitamins, or the issue is not the vitamins. The issue may be something else.
Because you take some B vitamins.
Yeah, our friend Kathleen Stewart, she has an interesting method where she recommends drop dosing more. And so you kind of take like a small, maybe you put it in some liquid or something and take a sip. But one advantage to that is that, if you forget to go back to that cup throughout the day and you don't feel like a calling to go back and have more because maybe you didn't get a boost, half the time you don't finish the cup because maybe you didn't really need it. So it kind of takes away the just popping another pill and just assuming that it's doing something, because you're having to go actively take a sip if you want it.
Yeah, it's the same approach.
So I like that approach a little. Like,
if you don't feel the benefit, you don't go back to it. Yeah. In my case, if you don't feel the benefit, you don't take it the next day, right? So you skip a few days and then basically you try to find out the schedule, the most sparse schedule, which produces the biggest benefit, versus taking it every day, even for a minor benefit. That not only you're not getting much of the benefit, but it creates a habit, and habits in general are not good for us. We're not habitual creatures. Society makes
it's
us
a very expensive habit.
Yeah, it's a very expensive one. You're ingesting a lot of potential excipients. I mean, I know conscious people about this will try to look for a pure supplement, but even then, like, unless you test it, you don't know what's inside of it. And also, I mean, again, it makes you dependent on something. That's another thing. It's like some people, when they've taken even a B vitamin for a long time and they run out of it and they don't have like a supply, they freak out. They create like a nervous tension. It's like, oh my God, I've missed my niacinamide. What am I going to do without it? You'll be fine.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, it's almost psychological at that point.
I'm like the worst supplement taker ever. I'm the worst. I forget. I'm a big food first person. And I think that there's some sort of like subconscious barrier for me taking supplements, but that drop dosage just seems so much more like natural of like your body actually like calling for it.
Well, that's Kathleen's whole thing, is, from what I understand, she's really learned like what symptoms correlate with, oh, I need more of that. So she'll go take that, and then she takes it and it's enough, like you said, for another week. So she has that down. And I think Georgie talking about how to, take less and, try to space out when you need your dose is really important, because pretty much every recommendation, even on the supplement jar, is just take one per day. And so then now you're taking one per day of like 15 different things. You have no idea what's doing what. So it's very challenging. You almost need to just kind of like stop everything, kind of like what you do, and add one at a time and see, oh, did that even have an effect? Oh, I probably don't need that. But that's very hard for people who have developed the addiction to taking it, thinking that it's fixing their problems.
I'll quote Ray here. Somebody asked him in an email, it's like, hey, Ray, I kind of lost interest in supplementing with niacinamide. He said, you're probably on the right track.
Oh. yeah.
So there's no doubt that B vitamin supplementation can be useful. Your studies are documenting it. There's so many people that have talked about it.
Studies have shown increased excretion. Like basically, if you're under stress, you excrete the same amount of, if more, of the B vitamins as a chronic alcoholic. And we know that they're losing more B vitamins. So stress, if you're under stress, and usually those are the people that benefit the most. But again, the benefit kind of plateaus if you're taking them every day. So the point is, I guess, to take it only really when you feel like, man, I really need an extra oomph, like an extra boost, instead of like, oh, if I take it every day, it's going to prevent all these issues from happening in the future. No, the stress is actually what you really should be focusing on and trying to reduce as much as possible, or avoid, not reduce, avoid. Avoidance is a better approach than the reduction, because the reduction is the pharma company's approach. They're saying, accept that life is going to suck, which is going to give you a pill about it, right? And I still think that it's possible to make life largely not suck if you're willing to take a hard look at what your choices have been so far and what your priorities are. That's not nothing that can be avoided. I think every person, at least once in their life, they have a come to Jesus meeting with themselves and saying, what I'm doing is not working.
Something that you were saying about how like the lack of enjoyment of life is a huge predictor of ill health. That is very much associated with just chronically undereating. And so a lot of our past podcasts have been centered around the starvation experiments. And
starvation experiments.
So would you say that undereating is another block because you're just essentially not providing enough of the inputs and cofactors?
That, and also it's one of the original evolutionary signals of impending bad times, right? It's insufficient presence of food. And what this triggers is for the body is to start conserving glycogen and glucose and switching over to fats. They're the long-term provider of energy when things are not going well. And I emphasize not going well around you or in you. And basically, like, they're just you use that when there's nothing better available to actually eat. And when you're not eating enough, then this energy, first of all, your body will lower its metabolic rate, but that's not a good thing. And the way it lowers it is that
well, it's an advantageous thing for the body, because if we aren't consuming enough food and the body is pushing the metabolism, we will probably die.
It will consume itself. So obviously not a good thing. So the body says, okay, you're under stress, you're not enough food, I'm going to lower your metabolic rate. But when it lowers the metabolic rate, it means less energy is being produced. This comes at a sacrifice of a lot of functions that we consider luxurious, and even medicine considers luxurious, but they're not. Like the anhedonia, the lack of enjoyment from life, higher cognitive function. I challenge anybody who is in a low carb or like a fasting regimen to measure their creativity before, during, and after. I guarantee you will not be very creative while you're semi-starved or you're low carbing. You may have energy for like doing long-term repetitive work, which is what the slow oxidation of fats can provide energy for, but you will not be able to sprint, okay? You will not be able, to go on a concert and jump for 3 hours in the air and have fun with other people around you. You will probably not be able to muster up the explosive force that needed to lift something heavy on the farm. You'll just be basically barely kind of getting by. You'll be conscious, but not really cognizant of many of the things that are going on around you. So that's really what happens when you have reduction in calories, often combined with stress. But the mechanism is the same. The body says, okay, stress, insufficient energy. Okay, I'm going to lower my energetic demands, right? But this means I'm going to neglect some functions such as, and one of the first one that goes, by the way, is fertility. And it's objectively measurable. If you're under eating or you're under stress or you're eating a low carb diet, both men and women become infertile. There is the extreme form of that. It's been studied a lot in females, not so much in males. It's known as the female athlete triad. And it's basically elite female athletes are almost always infertile while in their really competitive periods. And one of the symptoms is that they have no period. No period. They also have no ovulation. And when they try to conceive, they cannot. I mean, if there's no period, usually means basically you're not fertilizing the eggs. You're not producing the healthy eggs that are ready for fertilization. And the cure for that is stopping the exhaustive exercise that you're doing, eating more. And if that doesn't work, anti-prolactin drugs such as bromocriptine, progesterone also recently found to help. Anti-cortisol drugs such as RU486. In other words, everything that is about stress is telling your body focus on the basics, which is keeping your heart beating, your arms and legs moving, and that's about it. Digestion suffers tremendously, basically slows down when you're under stress. I don't know if people have noticed, but if you're under stress, not only you don't feel as hungry, but that's because your cortisol is high and your blood, which raises blood sugar, but also like you process food a lot more slowly. If you're in good health and you're eating properly, you probably go to the bathroom once or twice a day. If you're under stress, even if you're eating regularly, that will become much more rare. 2 times or 3 times weekly at most. And even doctors will agree that's not a good sign. So that you don't want this buildup of toxins inside of you. So very good.
No, I one time went 9 days without pooping, and the doctor
emergency.
Wasn't really concerned.
Really?
That,
Yeah. For adults, yes.
Well,
for kids under 12, I think they're saying 1 week. If there's nothing in 1 week, you gotta come to the ER because it could be like a impacted colon or something, right? But for adults, I think they're fine. They're like, there's this. I have to send you this link. A guy on Reddit who did complete. He was morbidly obese, so he did like complete fasting, right, for like I think a month or 2, no poop whatsoever, and then basically started eating once a day only, and continued not pooping for like months. And I think eventually ended up in a hospital with like sepsis or something because of the buildup of this fecal matter. But again, peristalsis, which is a movement, requires energy. If you're not eating, if you're not providing especially if you're not providing the macronutrients needed for the high energetic things such as gastrointestinal motility, then this thing will not move. You'll get stuck in there. So another reason to keep metabolic rate high, avoiding stress, which slows your metabolic rate, slows your gastrointestinal motility, slows everything that is really enjoyable about being a human. But they've convinced us that more pain, more gain.
I think unfortunately a lot of especially the people that listen to our content are stuck in the state of they start eating so little. So now, like you said, their metabolic rate has lowered, but they're still holding on to excess fat. So they do have fat that it would potentially be worthwhile to shed in the future. But the only way that they see is to eat less and less and less. And so, yes, they're constipated. Maybe they lose their cycle. They're becoming more estrogen dominant because they're not pooping and they're not producing progesterone.
Lose that good ratio of muscle to fat.
Exactly.
So it's
a really tough place to be, because then people are like a lot of our prior podcast discussions from this season have been, okay, well, you need to start eating more slowly to get out of this state. But when somebody is already feeling overweight, that is really challenging.
Yeah.
So is there anything that when they're in this state, they can do that would help get out of it?
And
yes to everything. Pharmacologically, in a really bad state, it's been shown. I don't know if we discussed the Bigger Loser study. Man, such an apt name. So they put these morbidly obese people through a grueling schedule, a combination of fasting and exhaustive exercise. And some of them managed to lose enough weight to make it to the finale of the Biggest Loser show, and they got these awards, right? Every single person who participated in that show, whether they lost weight or not, I mean, the ones that lost weight, when they dropped out of the show, basically they not only regained all of their weight that they used to have, most of them overshot it by a significant percentage and on fewer calories than they were eating before the show. And they were devastated, like, okay, it was really torturing to eat like half of the calories that I was eating before so I can lose this weight. And now that I'm out of the show, okay, I've increased my calories just a little bit more because I don't want to starve, like for the rest of my life. And now I'm ballooning and I've overshot my original weight. How is this possible? And then there was a study on these participants, and they found out that they really tanked their resting metabolic rate. Because when you're fasting and exhaustively exercising, which in that case mostly meant endurance exercise, they weren't lifting weights, they were running on a treadmill and whatnot, then you're losing predominantly muscle. And I have a study about this on the blog as well. So muscle tissue is much better innervated and supplied with blood than fatty tissue is. So when you're starving and when you're stressing yourself, such as exhaustive exercise, the presumption is that you're going to be, yes, you'll be losing muscle because your cortisol will be high, but you'll also be losing fat. So maybe ideally, at least the presumption for most doctors that I've seen is that you're going to be losing about the same. But when you lose most of this excess fat, everything will start back to normal. Then you can rebuild the muscle back. That's not how it works. Looks like you're losing more muscle than fat in a 3-to-1 ratio. And that's a terrible outcome. So which means that as you're losing the weight, first you're losing predominantly muscle. And then once you get to a point, yes, you will lose weight and you'll meet some numbers there. But then at that point, you have a much lower lean to fat mass ratio than when you started. And now your resting metabolic rate is basically down in the drain. And when you stop doing whatever you're doing, this participation or meeting a goal of specific pounds or kilos, right? Then you have only two choices. You either have to remain on that grueling regimen for the rest of your life.
900 calories a day.
It's probably only going to get harder and
Exactly.
harder and harder
But the
too.
thing is,
Like you got to
over
keep
time,
reducing.
you'll find that actually even those calories will result in a buildup even more fat because your body adapts at a lower metabolic rate, and especially if the cortisol. Oh, that's another nasty thing. Doctors tell you, okay, yes, cortisol rises when you're under stress and when you're exercising, but when you stop doing these things, cortisol goes back to normal. And that's true, but in the blood, because cortisol has a negative feedback mechanism. And if you give cortisol, it inhibits its own synthesis in the adrenals. Turns out the cortisol, really pernicious mechanism, peripherally has a positive feedback mechanism. So once you're under stress, cortisol increases the actual genetic expression of the enzyme that synthesizes cortisol. So you're getting a positive feedback cycle. So if you're being under a lot of stress for a long time, even when you stop and the stress is gone, you will be overproducing the same amount of cortisol peripherally in the tissues where it matters, because that's where you store the fat. So once your body adapts to the high cortisol lifestyle, its enzymatic machinery remains like that. And an animal study gave some bad news. It does not restore back to normal unless you give something to these animals that basically inhibits either the production of the excessive amounts of cortisol or blocks the cortisol at the receptor level to kind of give your body the signal that, okay, you don't have as much cortisol as before. So metabolism can get restored. In the absence of either one of these, and actually that study that I'm citing, it tried to mimic the Biggest Loser study. These animals, after that, kept getting fatter and fatter and fatter on the lower calorie diets until they got to the point where basically they looked like these little footballs, furry footballs. And they had to give them it's also an abortion drug, but it was designed as a cortisol blocker, known as IO486, mifepristone. Pharma industry knows about this. That's the really messed up part. Multiple clinical trials are running right now with the chemicals known as 11-beta-HSD1 inhibitors. 11-beta-HSD1 is the enzyme that is the rate-limiting step, the gateway keeper to how much cortisol you will be producing. And you can produce cortisol in many other tissues, not only your adrenals, just like estrogen. Because during menopause, when the ovaries fail, since most of the estrogen and progesterone in the blood is coming from the ovaries, when the ovaries fail, you get low levels of these steroids, right? And doctors will say menopause is a stage of progesterone and estrogen deficiency. Yeah, but that's in the blood. Nobody so far had looked in the tissues. Actually, they have. Women with breast cancer, when they look in their breast tissue, very high amounts of estrogen, zero progesterone. Same thing with cortisol. Turns out that you can have normal, even low levels of cortisol in the blood, but you can have very high levels in the tissues. And the doctors, one of the reasons they're probably refusing to admit that cortisol may be the primary driver of obesity and diabetes is that in most such patients, blood levels of cortisol are normal, sometimes even low. They're saying, no, they need more cortisol. But if you look at their tissue levels, they have extremely high levels of cortisol. And pharma companies now are running clinical trials. You can type on Google, 11-beta-HSD1 inhibitor obesity or diabetes. You're going to get a ton of different clinical trials with humans, basically recognizing that it's cortisol driving these things, which means stress is driving these things. And the only way to get out of this, if you're in a really messed up state, you have a lot of extra weight and most of it is fat, exerting yourself more not only will not do any good, you're going to get even worse state because you activate the positive feedback cycle of cortisol peripherally. So every time you overexert yourself after you're already in a bad state, you're contributing to the pathology. If you get any benefit, you'll be very tiny. If you lose any weight, you'll be mostly muscle. It's a really terrible outcome. And the way you get to that outcome is by not eating sufficient amount of calories, predominantly fat, and also being under chronic stress. That alone is sufficient to cause every single degenerative disease that we know of.
So basically, in summary, it's okay to lose weight, but if you don't fix energy metabolism, you're just going to go back to where you were.
Worse, because you endured some stress to get to your like desired level of. And most doctors, they don't look at the composition of the body. As long as you're losing weight, the scale is dropping down. Like, oh, great, everything's fine. Keep losing weight. No, have you measured their fat percentage? Because if very easy, they have these like devices in most gyms. And you can actually tell directly when a person is losing weight that they're losing mostly muscle because their average body fat percentage goes up while they're slimming down on the scale.
So it's important to strength train
Yes.
to keep your muscle mass
Yes.
up, hold on to
Yes.
muscle. And one of the best ways to hold on to muscle is to have a good metabolism, because then your body isn't wasting muscle tissue for energy.
And not be under stress.
So remove those barriers.
Oh, by the way, being under sunlight, great anti-stress effect, declined levels of cortisol peripherally and centrally. Something about, I think, fundamentally, the mammalians are, unless you're nocturnal, night is bad, which is lack of light, right? All bad things happen at night. You get attacked by predators, your metabolism slows down.
Raccoons kill our chickens.
Yeah. But during the day, basically, everything is great, It's not uncommon to go to these like retirement homes and see people that like in their 80s and 90s at night, they're half dead. But during the day, they're perked up, they go outside, they walk around, they're capable actually physically of walking, but at night they need a wheelchair. I had a very good, biochemical explanation. The red light activates several of the electron transport chain complexes, prevents the buildup of nitric oxide, increases the synthesis of dopamine, which is a pro-energetic molecule, suppresses the synthesis of serotonin, which is a metabolic inhibitor. We really evolved to be under sunlight, bright light that has a very high amount of the red spectrum. Just to finish on for the people recommendation, if they're in a really bad state. So what happens if somebody's so obese that basically any attempt to diet, basically it's like they feel like it's going to kill them, and it probably will if they continue doing it.
Yeah.
Ask your doctor about potentially trying RU486 or actually even another drug which is already approved by the FDA for treating type 2 diabetes. It's known as bromocriptine. It's a dopamine agonist. It lowers prolactin in the body and also lowers estrogen, because prolactin and estrogen always go together. And which goes back to and it's been shown to result in weight loss, specifically fat loss, in people with type 2 diabetes who are invariably overweight. Actually, most of them are like officially meet the criteria of obesity. Short of that, there are some natural things that can help. I know you don't want aspirin, but aspirin's metabolite, salicylic acid, is an inhibitor of 11-beta-HSD1, and it's widely available. There are other natural substances that are stronger than salicylic acid, aspirin. Something called imodin, which is found in rhubarb root and also cascara bark.
Cascara.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Imodin is the most potent, not known natural, in other words, not synthesized in the lab in any way, most potent natural inhibitor of 11-beta-HSD1 to medicine. In fact, there are clinical trials with imodin, believe it or not, and which means if they're successful, you're going to get taken off the market. But if nothing else, it's a confirmation that even pharma thinks that inhibiting the excess amount of cortisol can lead to sustained weight loss without loss of muscle mass. So you're going to be losing mostly fat. So if you're really in a bad state, bromocriptine or RU486. If you can slightly less bad state, or you can even in the bad state, you can try the imodin or the cascara, right? Or the aspirin, right? And then for the ones that are on their way there but not already there, stop overexerting yourself. If you exercise, make sure it's mostly weightlifting, and even then, mostly concentric movements. And then, if you don't like weightlifting, swimming is a decent approximation to concentric only. And if you really, really insist on aerobic exercise, because you're facing resistance only when you're pushing the water away, not when you're recovering. So another one, which is kind of like a combination of endurance and concentric, but it's purely concentric, is biking. But don't bike to the point, don't do the things that a lot of people recommend to bike 10 miles. That's not the point. The point is that when you're pushing the pedals, right, it's basically the muscle is contracting with a load. In other words, only when you're pressing on the pedal. When there's the recovery, the muscle is resting. And that's purely as close to purely concentric as you can get. Another good one is rowing, more esoteric. That's what I used to do in college. Yeah. Also, you can get an erg machine or an ergometer machine at home. And that one is actually 100% concentric. It's like when you pull it, there's resistance, but then when there's recovery, there's no resistance. So those will be the rowing, the biking, and the swimming have a endurance component in them because they're more long. They last longer, And a lot of doctors are not happy until their patients are doing some kind of a endurance exercise. So if you want to appease your doctor while still staying more or less on the safe side, one of these three types of exercises, but I still prefer the weightlifting. Builds a lot more muscle mass, and prevents actually muscle breakdown if you're doing it the right way. And it's a much more effective way. It also lasts, less. Like, nobody has like 3 hours to bike every day, right? You shouldn't be biking even if you had them. But I'm saying with the weightlifting, even 15 minutes is enough. But if you do some of the other ones, they're taking longer. So no matter how you look at it, weightlifting is probably as close you can get to like the perfect, exercise and appeal, which is actually exercise itself. And then dietary wise, just try to cut down on the fat while you're recovering. Don't do more than 1 gram of protein per kilogram of body weight, because it will put strain in your kidneys, and that strain increases while you're exercising, because while you exercise there is some muscle breakdown, so there will already be elevated creatinine in the blood. When you add in more protein, that level will increase more. So
did you say 1 gram per kilogram body weight?
And actually, if you want to get specific, it's 1 gram per kilogram of lean body weight. So like subtract about 15 to 20% of your weight, because actually more, because there's bone too. But just subtract the fat, which is 15 to 20%, and base it off of that. That should be enough, unless you're heavy lifting.
Would that include the collagen and gelatin, or would that be supplementary to the?
No, that will be the regular protein, which includes the all of the essential amino acids. You can add more
like the
gelatin
animal
on top of that, almost as much as you want. I wouldn't overdo it still, because any protein will produce ammonia when it gets broken down, right? But I know people who are eating like 2 grams per kilogram of they're bodybuilders. They obviously use steroids too.
Yeah.
And they're adding another 2 grams per kilogram of body weight gelatin to offset the pro-inflammatory effects of the methionine, tryptophan, and cysteine. Their kidneys are just fine. But I wouldn't go there. I'm saying it's possible to do that.
I think someone's metabolic state can really impact how well they utilize protein, because protein in general is very thermogenic, but it does compete with carbohydrates for that's just how the body is designed.
So if you're not eating too much protein, most of the protein should go towards tissue buildup and repair. If you're eating too much, some of it will get converted to glucose, and that's a bad process. We don't want that. Any amount of deamination, converting protein to glucose, is a bad thing, because you're going to create ammonia, and ammonia is universally toxic. Now, you will get that even with the gelatin, but the process is actually less. For some reason, nobody understands why you're generating less ammonia when you're eating the gelatin. And also it has pro kidney function effects. So the gelatin will kind of compensate a little bit for the fact that it will increase ammonia if you overdo it. Regular protein does not do that. So I think that's why you can get away with more gelatin than regular protein. So if you're eating, let's say 1 gram per kilogram is your normal protein that you're eating from your daily food, you can add as much as like an additional 1 gram per kilogram of body weight of gelatin, but I don't think that's needed. Studies have shown that as little as 1 tablespoon daily is enough to give you most of the benefits for bone health, skin health, and whatnot, for glucose metabolism. So we're trying to keep things as simple as possible, not add more to what people are already taking.
And then one more question. If someone has a family member that does have cancer, do you know of any doctors that are taking a more bioenergetic metabolism focus that they could maybe reach out to?
I posted about two doctors on the forum. One of them is either retired or about to retire, a very famous neurologist from North Carolina. But he's actually now, after he's been following me on the forum for a long time, and he said he advised several people, because he's a neurologist, several people with neurological cancers, actually B1 therapy. He sent me an email. I don't think it was a meningioma, which was pressing on a person's brain and was about to herniate, which is universally deadly. And then in such situation, the only solution is emergency surgery, which obviously, it's very dangerous to get operated on your brain. So he said, well, I saw the study that vitamin B1 acts like acetazolamide. In other words, it increases the carbon dioxide in the brain. I gave her the high dosage. I think it was like 1 gram daily or something, and she recovered. She didn't need the surgery. And the tumor shrank. So it's not a malignant tumor. The meningiomas, I think, are more or less benign, but they grow. And anything growing in the cavity, like in the head, eventually will get pressure, like on a spinal column or a brain, and that's a very bad situation.
When you use the B1, are you just using the thiamine HCl?
That's the one I use for the study, specifically because I want it to be as cheap and widely available as possible. Later on, I may do things with like allithiamine and see if I can get it. So right now we're at the discovery stage. If everything works out, then we can do optimization with more expensive but more effective things and not as widely available. I mean, L-thiamine, you can find it in the Western countries, but try finding L-thiamine in like Africa or like India.
What is the name of that doctor if someone wants to?
Charles Matthews, but I'll send you the link. I created the link saying for people who want to contact doctors that are following pro-metabolic approach, here are the two contacts. Two doctors.
Oh, amazing.
One in South Carolina.
It's going to be in the description.
Awesome.
That's
Perfect.
awesome.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, Georgie, where can people find you? Where can people buy some good B vitamins? Let them
Many
know
other
the links.
things too. For
Well,
their pets.
they can find me in DC. if you want to come and see real crazy people, and I do mean crazy people. No, seriously, people on the street in DC are, I know, starting to. I don't blame them, but
I don't know. The guy you described earlier
he's
sounds pretty
homeless
cool.
and he doesn't mingle with those people. He's by himself most of the time.
Okay.
He's got his buddies. They drink, sipping whiskey at night. They play the guitar. It's almost like brings him back to my high school years. Yeah, that's all he does.
So the crazy people aren't the homeless
Exactly.
people.
And actually, I would rephrase that.
Whoa.
The crazy people are a lot more normal than you think. The crazy really is a self-defense mechanism, I think, evolutionary, is that for people to leave you alone. So it's like once the world becomes too overwhelming, if you continue to act normal and you have your normal responsibilities, they will never leave you alone. We all have responsibilities, right?
Yeah.
But the moment even I start act crazy, my own family's like, let's just give a little bit of a break. He's like, starting to act weird. And I'm like, you give me ideas. Maybe these people on the street that are acting like that. I mean, I know some of them are. It's obvious that they're crazy. The clothing, like the way, like the skin health and whatnot. But this one guy, I mean, actually several, his buddies, the guitar playing buddies, they look like a band from the 1960s, right? And they're sitting on a lawn 100 yards from the White House. I'm right now about 200 yards from the White House. They're in the middle. There's a park right in front of my building. They get fed 3 times a day. All they do is roll on the grass all day. So they used to smoke weed, not anymore. But they drink alcohol every night and they play until like 2 o'clock in the morning. And they're the healthiest looking people for their age. They're all in their 70s that I know. So something to be said about fun and having no, I don't want to say no responsibilities, but like giving up on society. I think it's a middle ground what you girls are having there. Like you have a farm.
I think that was one of the suggestions that we provided in our last episode with you, was like, if you can, just escape from society.
Yeah, did I say run away in the woods with somebody you love for like a month?
Run away. Yes.
Yeah. Not alone though. Like even though, because it can be stressful. If somebody who you trust and or love, that's ideal. At one person, it could be more.
So we're still suggesting that.
Yeah. And in fact, if you do that, I doubt we're going to hear from you again, because you'll realize how insane modern urban life is, and you'll just won't go back.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're in DC, but where can people find you online?
Blog. Online I post under the alias Heydude, HAID as in dog, UT as in Tom. So heydude.me. That's my personal blog. And this feeds into Twitter, which is Twitter, or now X, I guess, .com/same alias, Heydude. And that's usually where I interact with people.
Where does Heydude come from?
It means rebel fighter, guerrilla fighter. So basically,
in Bulgaria.
So they were all over the Balkan Peninsula, and Bulgaria is one of those countries.
Oh, okay.
So that you'll find the word Heydude in Serbian, Croatian, Macedonian, Romanian. In Turkish, who were the invaders, Heydude is a bad word. It means a mountain criminal, which they were. But that's how you topple a corrupt invading army. you gotta fight the resistance fight. So yeah, I still frequent the Repeat forum. I don't post that much these days there anymore, because it's now they're testing. I mean, I'm not bashing it, they're experimenting with a very low vitamin A diet, which I personally disagree with. I don't think it's having the effects that they claim they are. But because the topics that I post on now, such as vitamin D, aspirin, vitamin A, which I also like a lot, they're incompatible with what the forum is currently experimenting with. I don't really post there right now. So you can find me there. Maybe we can exchange messages, but I don't post new studies there. For new studies, the blog and Twitter.
Okay.
Great.
And then idealabs.com.
Yes, if you want to mention it. I was going to say, look, I don't want to promote my products. You can find some very good B vitamins on Amazon, even if you pay attention to the label. Pure Bulk is one company that sells them in bulk.
Yep.
And I've tried their powder products. They're pretty good. I've never had intestinal irritation from them and whatnot. I don't have any relationship to Pure Bulk. And then my company sells some of those vitamins in liquid form, especially the 4 fat soluble vitamins, and also the B vitamins. So the B vitamins, the product that we sell, it's not going to give you the same amount as the ones used for the cancer study, but it's not meant for people with cancer, right? So that cancer study was already for advanced deadly disease. For that level, you can get it from Pure Bulk or other Amazon vendors that are sell them without excipients.
All right,
Great.
Thank you, Georgi,
Thank
for your
you,
time.
girls.
We'll have to get you on
Appreciate
again
it.
soon. Appreciate it. Yeah. All right, we'll talk soon.